is something you're never going to be able to unsee.
This was a brutal, vicious, and evil murder.
We lost this amazing woman who loved being a mother more than anything else in the world.
Who's she talking to? What's the connection? Could he possibly be the killer?
Perhaps she threatened to expose their relationship to his wife. He wanted things his way and only his way.
She does have a .32 caliber handgun.
And they said, I just killed Missy.
This was an odd twist to this investigation.
We need to get the timeline as quickly as possible so that we can catch who the killer is.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Small city with plenty of southern charm, just 34 miles southeast of Nashville, offering a quiet escape from the hustle and bustle of Music City.
Murfreesboro is often considered a bedroom community of Nashville. The people here are very well educated. There's a lot of good jobs here.
In its day, it was a small town. Most people who lived there had been born and raised there. Everybody knew everybody.
Population has increased well over 100,000 now, but I would consider it a safe town.
We do have our share of property crime, but we do not have a real problem with homicide, although one homicide is one too many.
But on a quiet Sunday afternoon, a 911 call comes into the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office that shakes this sleepy town wide awake.
911?
Yes, sir.
I think my daughter's been murdered. There's blood on the back of her head. She's laying on the bed face down.
She's not breathing?
No.
Okay. I'll get somebody to you, okay?
On December 16th at 4:20 p.m., Doug Atkin reported that his daughter had been killed. This was the worst situation that I can imagine a parent discovering.
First responders arrive at the victim's home 4 minutes later at 4:24 p.m.
Room of the house. She is lying face down on the bed. Her hands are zip-tied behind her. She is not wearing any clothing from the waist down. There is blood added near her head and also on the bed itself. This was a brutal, vicious, and evil murder.
The victim is a devoted 36-year-old single mom named Melissa Atkin, better known as Missy.
Everyone that loves her and cares about her calls her Missy. There's not a person in the world that would hate this girl. She's got a very beautiful spirit.
As a young single mother, she could have played the victim card, but that was not in her DNA. Being a good parent was her greatest pride in her life and certainly her biggest responsibility.
Missy was a very devoted single mother. She loved her son, Lucas. Everything that she did was centered around Lucas.
Heading up the investigation into the brutal murder of Missy Atkin are detectives Ralph Marisick and Troy Hooker of the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office.
As soon as we arrived at the scene, and we did a walkthrough back to the bedroom to see where Missy was. It was almost like somebody was in the process of cleaning, doing a little housework. There was no bedding on the bed. It had been stripped off. Articles of clothing throughout the floor. The blinds in her bedroom were completely up, which was kind of odd for her to be naked and the blinds completely up. Some things that just kind of raised some red flags.
Her hands are tied behind her back. It's not a very good scene at this point. There's a million possibilities, a million different scenarios that we're trying to process now.
And then it hit me who it was. I knew her. My wife and her were very close friends.
It was hard. With her body nude and zip-tied, face down on the bed, our first thought is that we've got some type of sex assault and murder that followed.
When we see these findings, as well as a body that's been unclothed, whether perimortem or postmortem, this is deemed a sexual homicide, even if a conventional sexual assault or rape has not occurred.
To solve Missy Atkins' murder, investigators will need to reconstruct the final 24 hours of her life. They begin by processing the crime scene.
Looking at Miss Atkin, you could tell that she had been shot in the back of the head more than once. That was apparent.
There's blood spatter on her back, consistent with her being bound.
Had to consider, how did this particular crime happen? It appears that she was cleaning up her bedroom, and Missy may have been very much surprised by someone entering the home, and this strongly indicates that someone was able to overpower her quickly, force her onto the bed, and forcibly tie with zip ties her hands behind her back, and then to execution style shoot her in the head.
When we moved her body, the bullet just kind of dropped out onto the mattress. This bullet was pristine, like it just taken off of the case.
Looking at it, I could tell that it was probably a .32 caliber.
The bullet was sent to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Crime Laboratory for verification.
This happened within a ballpark of 12-hour window. There's no decomposition. The rigor on her body is fixed, so we know we're past a 4-hour window. So we're probably 4 to 12 hours. Definitely she had not been there very long, half a day.
With the bedroom processed, detectives work their way through the remainder of the house, looking for clues that will help them build a narrative of Missy's murder.
The house was locked, the windows were all locked. Nothing was damaged, but the sliding door had been forced open.
It was wide open, and the curtains were actually blowing to the outside. Based on those observations, whoever came to the house did not have a key. It had rained that Saturday night and early Sunday morning, and the outside of the home on Grassland Drive was wet and muddy. There were muddy footprints in the kitchen area. Those footprints were then later examined to try to help establish who had been inside the home.
As far as the property, the electronics are all there. There's jewelry. Nothing looked like it had been burglarized or any type of theft.
From examining the crime scene, the detectives did not believe that this was a robbery that had gone wrong.
They begin to consider alternative theories of the crime.
The method of the murder is often used to tell you about the relationship between the murder victim and the killer. The police considered 3 distinct possibilities. One, that it was a rape and a murder. The second possibility was that it wasn't a rape, but it was staged to appear to be a rape. Or the third possibility, she was left there in that position simply to humiliate her.
As police finish processing the crime scene, one of Missy's neighbors comes forward with information.
One of the neighbors established that he had seen Missy about 11:45-ish on the evening of the 15th, going into the 16th.
While he was driving her house, that gave us a time of 11:45 that we knew she was still alive.
Detectives are now able to determine that Missy was killed sometime between 11:45 p.m. on December 15th and 4:20 p.m. on December 16th, when her body was found. They turn to Missy's parents, Linda and Doug Atkin, hoping they can shed light on who might have wanted to harm Missy.
You can tell they're upset, but they know they've got to get us information about the timeline as quickly as possible so that we can catch who the killer is.
On the night of Friday, December 14th, Linda and Doug saw Missy at the karate studio, where she and Lucas trained.
Also present was Lucas's biological father, Scott Reynolds.
Scott had picked up Luke. There was some argument over who was going to have Luke that weekend because she was planning a party for him, and it was Scott's weekend.
The relationship between Scott and Missy could only be described as one that was rocky.
After handing Lucas off to his father, Scott Reynolds, Missy's parents wanted to keep their daughter company that Saturday.
They spent the day of Saturday, December 15th, mostly with Missy. And sometime between 7:30 and 8, Melissa said that she had to go to Walmart. she asked her mother to call her a Sunday morning, to give her a wake-up call.
Missy was supposed to go see her father at the church because he was getting a special recognition that day.
So the next morning, Missy's parents make the phone call all around 7:30. Missy doesn't answer. So her parents go ahead and go to church without her.
Missy being late to things from time to time, they probably just assumed she was going to show up at some point.
Later that afternoon, at approximately 4 o'clock, they go check on her.
I can imagine him walking in the hallway, calling out for his daughter. And then walking into her bedroom and seeing her, in the same way we found her. Except that's his daughter. It's something you're never going to be able to unsee.
During the interview, the Atkins were asked if they knew of anyone who might possibly want to harm their daughter.
Doug and Linda are very forthcoming about Missy's very volatile relationship with Scott, her ex and father of Lucas. And you talk about Missy and her personality and her friends. I mean, this is a woman who is loved by everybody except Scott. So Scott is the most viable candidate for having killed Missy.
In the fatal shooting of 36-year-old single mom Missy Atkin, investigators have her ex-boyfriend, Scott Reynolds, who is also the father of her only child, in their sights.
They found her, and she said Missy's dead. And the first words out of my mouth were, he did it, he finally did it, he took her from us.
Scott Reynolds is a construction worker. He had met Melissa 10 years previous. They had a relationship for several years. People who knew Scott would say that Scott could charm you and was a person who could get angry with you. Scott was very controlling of Missy, very manipulative.
He wanted things his way and only his way, and if she were to push back too much, that it would kind of blow up between them.
It's a on-again, off-again, kind of a contentious relationship where eventually Missy kicks him out. But it's a complex relationship in the fact that they also have a son together.
With a child together, Scott and Missy are still very present in one another's lives, and their relationship worsens.
The main source of the tension between Scott and Missy was custody issue and visitation. Scott felt he was entitled to have Lucas at exact equal time as Missy. Missy felt during the week that Lucas needed to stay home near school and near other activities.
Scott has an obsessed view of Lucas. This is his son. He loves him, but he's obsessed to the point that he doesn't want anyone else to have him.
At points as they were discussing their co-parenting arrangement, Scott would make threatening remarks to her in hopes that she would back down.
The week of Missy's murder, the fights got even uglier.
Missy was planning a birthday party for Lucas, but that weekend was supposed to be Scott's weekend. Scott objected, and he was not going to allow Missy to have Lucas. So that Friday at the karate studio, he was there to pick up Lucas and take him for the weekend.
Less than 2 days later, Missy is found brutally murdered.
Scott Reynolds was a person who needed to be investigated because he had expressed his anger toward Missy. He was never physically abusive. He did not have a criminal record, but he expressed that he hated her, and he was very upset about the custody arrangement and the visitation.
With Missy's ex, Scott Reynolds, in their crosshairs, detectives bring him in for questioning.
Scott's a big man. I mean, this guy is a powerful, strong man, and appeared to be somewhat upset and very cooperative.
My heart goes out to her family because I could not imagine walking in and finding my child.
To find your little boy?
Any parent finding their child, I don't know. I can imagine.
Is there anyone that wouldn't want her dead?
I just pissed off. I couldn't imagine. I mean, you know her. She's an easy person to get along with.
Scott relayed that they had some custody issues with Luke. I think Scott glossed over how serious it was.
I'm in this for my child. And her and I, we're done. There's no sex there. There's no feeling there. There's no nothing there between her and I. You know, only thing was between her and I was our son. Other than that, what she does on her time, I have no idea. But we used to get along so well, you know, and then all of a sudden she just really put her foot down and said, this is what I'm doing, whether you like it or not. I'm the mother, the law is on my side. This is how it's going to be. Usually we could talk things out, and it was just, this is a point where there was no talking.
Of course, we went into his alibi, what he was doing that weekend.
Scott told the police he was in Lewisburg, Tennessee with his new girlfriend, Eve Barger, Lucas, and his stepson, Tanner.
Lewisburg is 45 minutes to an hour from Missy's house. He's got a farm up there.
That night they eat, watch a little television, and at approximately 11 o'clock, Eve goes to bed. Scott and Tanner continue and watch the movie. The movie goes off sometime between 1 and 1:30, and they eventually all go to sleep.
Scott wakes up around 4 a.m., wakes his son Tanner up, and they go hunting that morning.
At approximately 5 a.m., Scott returns to Eve Barger's house and gets in the bed with Eve and Lucas. Scott and Eve get up at approximately 9 o'clock. They watch football during that day, and then approximately 7:30 p.m., Scott, Tanner, and Lucas leave Lewisburg and head back home.
Police ask to search Scott's house. They're looking for a .32 caliber gun, believed to be the murder weapon.
When police search the home, they don't find the murder weapon, and this isn't surprising. Very seldom would a killer be careless enough to bring that home or keep it in a place where it could be easily found.
When we search Scott's house, we find a pair of jeans that look like they've got blood on them and some black zip ties. We've got to send the jeans and the zip ties off to see if we have a match. We're thinking, oh, maybe we've got something we can link, and it would definitely point us in the right direction.
With the evidence mounting against him, detectives turn to Scott's new girlfriend, Eve Barger, to see if she'll back up his alibi.
She had met Scott Reynolds on eHarmony, and from that a relationship developed. She had been dating Scott for 3 to 4 months.
Eve tells investigators she's never met Missy, but she admits Scott has described their relationship as volatile.
Eve told the police about how much he hated engagement. She saw the anger in Scott, and that there was a real breakup in the relationship between Scott and Missy.
Since the murder weapon wasn't at the crime scene or at Scott's house, detectives ask Eve if she owns any guns.
One of the things she does mention was that she does have a .32 caliber handgun, which of course is red flags for us because that's the same caliber that was used to kill Missy Akin.
She had gotten the pistol during the time when she was divorcing her husband. She had kept the pistol with other firearm and ammunition. Both Eve and Scott had access to a .32 caliber gun and the .32 caliber ammunition on the night that Melissa Atkin was murdered.
But when detectives grill Eve about Scott's alibi that Saturday night and Sunday morning, her story matches his perfectly.
Eve was able to corroborate Scott's alibi. They were watching a movie and hanging around the house.
Scott had gotten up around 4 o'clock in the morning to take Tanner out to the deer stand and go hunting. He'd come back, got into bed with her, and then they got up later in the morning and continued their Sunday.
It's like, wow, he's locked in all Saturday night with multiple witnesses that put him in Lewisburg till the wee hours of the morning.
Investigators have to consider the possibility that Scott could have snuck out of the house while everyone was sleeping and killed Missy.
If we'd have found Missy's blood on those jeans, that would have been a huge thing. But it turns out the blood on the jeans was Tanner's.
And he had had a nosebleed, so that closes that avenue.
And the muddy footprints inside of the kitchen. Nothing conclusive could be determined as far as who made them or when they were made.
They did a comparison with the zip ties. There were a disproportionate amount of teeth. They weren't the same length, different manufacturer. They were not identical. Essentially, it was a dead end.
Next, detectives triangulate the location of Scott's cell phone that night to see if it will place him near Missy's house.
Scott insisted that his cell phone was in Lewisburg the night of the murder. And the examination revealed that there were no pings near Missy's home that night.
Checking the cell towers, his phone at least had remained in the Lewisburg area.
He's in Lewisburg with Eve around that time, which takes him out of the suspect pool.
With Missy's ex, Scott Reynolds, eliminated as a suspect. Detectives circle back to Missy's shopping trip in the hours leading up to her death.
So we pulled the Walmart video, which ended up being pretty significant as far as narrowing down the timeline.
The Walmart video showed Missy arriving at the Walmart parking lot at 8:52 p.m. on December the 15th, 2007. Approximately 9:30 p.m. and begins talking to her for approximately an hour. The man leaves and then comes back at approximately 10:40 p.m. The unknown man and Missy talked again for a few minutes. He then leaves the store at 10:47. Missy left the Walmart store at approximately 11:30 p.m. And this coincided with the neighbor reporting that he saw Missy through her window at 11:45 p.m. in her home.
Whoever she's talking to in Walmart, we know this is something she's comfortable with. It's someone we definitely have to interview. Other than the neighbor who saw her through the window, this is the last person that talked to her in person. This is the last person that actually saw her physically that we know of other than the killer.
The police now focus their attention on what they can determine about the unknown man and his involvement with Missy at Walmart.
Of course, then you want to look into who's she talking to, what's the connection, and could be possible the killer.
Detectives are zeroing in on a potential new suspect in the murder of 36-year-old Missy Atkin. A mystery man caught on security footage, speaking with her at length just hours before her murder.
Looking at Missy's phone records, the police discovered that Missy receives a phone call during the time that she is talking to the unknown man at Walmart. The phone call is from her brother, Kenneth. When the police interview Kenneth, he says that there was something unusual about the phone call. A man answered the phone, even though it was Melissa's phone number.
Some random guy's answering her phone, and he makes a comment. He's like, well, let me see if I can wake her up. So again, that's throwing up a lot of red flags for Ken, because now he's wondering what's going on. Who is this guy, and why are you answering my sister's phone?
Eventually, the mystery man reveals himself to be a mutual friend of both Ken and Missy.
So it turns out the person who answered Missy's phone was Randy Jameson. Randy thought it would be a good joke on Ken because at the time Ken was dating Randy's sister. But also Randy's one of the last people that sees Missy alive that night. So he's definitely going to be somebody that we need to talk to.
Through Missy's phone records, detectives confirm frequent and lengthy calls with Randy Jameson over the course of several months.
We understand, there's a good friendship there. Of course, he's married, but Randy was a very good friend of the family.
When trying to establish who might have committed a violent crime, you look at the people who have close relationships, because tempers can flare, emotions can get out of hand, and anger can cause violence.
Rarely are we dealing with a stranger.
For her deeply, and there might have been an issue surrounding his wife finding out. Perhaps Missy threatened to expose their relationship to his wife, and that's what he acted on.
What was the reason for an hour-long conversation? Although the police were aware that he did leave before she did, they did not know where he went after that, whether he followed her home possibly, or whether he had any other involvement with Melissa that night.
With suspicion swirling around Randy Jameson, detectives bring him down to the station for questioning.
He does say that he is indeed the person who was with Missy at Walmart. As he was leaving the store, he received a phone call from his wife. He then went back shopping and once again ran into Missy, and then left again approximately 10:47 p.m.
He indicated that he did have kind of a crush, I guess, or an interest in Missy had he not been married.
Detectives need to establish whether Randy Jameson had the opportunity to kill Missy.
When he left Walmart at 10:47, he went home at about 11:30 p.m. And when he arrived, his wife was home. He and his wife watched a little television and then went to sleep. His wife corroborates an airtight alibi.
With Randy Jameson eliminated as a suspect, the investigation into the murder of Missy Atkin hits a wall. But then, a surprising new witness comes forward.
Melissa's custody lawyer comes forward and provides the audio tapes of the Scott Reynolds' phone calls to Missy. This was an odd twist to this investigation. As custody began to become a real issue in the case, Missy decided that she needed to have those phone calls recorded to protect her.
Listen, please, I can't go without seeing my son. I'm not going to call until I get an answer.
The phone calls are important not only for the words spoken by Scott Reynolds, but also the tone expressed anger, the tone expressed disgust, the tone expressed a man who was desperate to get his own way.
You can either pick up your phone or I can come and find you. I don't care, but you're not going to keep me from going watching him and crying. You're going to talk to me. Either pick up the phone or I'm going to come and find you.
These are the phone calls from a person who may want to harm, to injure, or possibly even kill Melissa Atkins.
In the cold-blooded murder of Missy Atkin, her ex and son's father, Scott Reynolds, is back on police radar after they receive audio recordings of him threatening her.
You done lost your mind. You know, you're acting like a kid.
Some of them were pretty harsh to listen to Scott in his own words being threatening to Missy.
Either pick up the phone or I'm going to come and find you. You're going to talk to me, but I'm coming.
Although these audio recordings were strong evidence of motive, we needed further evidence to tie Scott Reynolds to the murder of Melissa Atkin. We needed corroboration.
Looking for answers, investigators turned to the medical examiner's autopsy report.
The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation determined that there was no evidence of a sexual assault. The way that her body was situated indicated that it was either for humiliation or to stage it, so it appeared to be a rape.
Whoever had come in to Missy's home that evening chose to leave her in a position of undress to lead the detectives in the wrong direction. The suggestion of a sexual motivation would lead them to other persons not connected to Scott Reynolds, our suspect.
When we rolled her over, we were able to recover a round there at the scene that was pristine. In addition, there were 3 other rounds in her skull that they pulled out at autopsy.
The autopsy report. Detectives also learned Missy was shot 4 times at point-blank range.
The projectile we recovered during the autopsy is called a cantilure. It has a ridge around the base of the bullet which helps seat the bullet in the casing. It's unusual because they had ceased doing that in manufacture several decades ago, which indicated that the bullet was antiquated and not in common use at all.
It's confirmed the bullets were manufactured in the 1960s, and they're made for a .32 caliber light pistol.
I mean, to find vintage ammo that old, what's the odds?
This was an important piece of information because Scott's girlfriend, Eve, mentioned to the investigators that she did own a .32 caliber pistol.
This is not a .22 revolver or a 9mm that could be in any gangbanger's hand. This is a relatively individuating weapon that naturally decreases the pool of potential owners and users of that weapon.
With this new information, detectives obtain a search warrant for Eve Barker's home and car.
She had a rifle, a shotgun, and in a small gun bag there was a pistol missing, which happened to be a .32 caliber pistol.
She's like, wait a minute, there's a gun missing out of that bag.
She acted surprised. She did not know that it was missing.
We're also able to locate in her car, in the center console, .32 caliber bullets.
Scott had access to Eve's house. Eve had access to a .32, the right type, right manufacturer.
Detectives also search Eve's property.
On Sunday, before Scott left, they burned all their trash. I had one of our evidence guys, but as he sifted through, we were able to find rivets and a label off a pair of Wrangler jeans. Scott was wearing a pair of Wranglers when he went up to Eve's place that Saturday.
We've got the missing weapon at Scott Reynolds' girlfriend's house that matches the ammunition found at the crime scene. We have similar bullets in her car. We've got a pair of burnt Wrangler jeans, which is Scott Reynolds' preferred pair. It is a mountain of circumstantial evidence that just keeps piling up.
The 1960s era bullets found in Eve's car are tested against the bullets used to kill Missy.
They matched the caliber of bullets that were found inside the body of Missy Atkin.
Definitely based on the evidence, the bullets, the ammunition, the missing gun. Eve was definitely a person of interest. That's also going to set off alarm bells, and we're going to be back focusing on Scott again.
The task for the investigators is complicated in that both Scott and Eve serve as each other's alibi, and that alibi is corroborated by Tanner.
Eve has gone from being a witness to a suspect in the murder of Missy Atkins.
The motivation is possibly jealousy, or trying to help out Scott for some reason, or trying to endear herself to Scott.
Investigators bring Eve Barker in for another round of questioning. They confront her with the mounting evidence against her.
Eve began to tell the police more and more about the relationship she observed between Scott and Missy.
I had a picture sitting there of Missy, and she looked at the picture. She looked at me, she started crying, and Eve said, "I've got to tell you something."
When Scott returned from the deer stand at 5 a.m. that morning, he couldn't rest properly.
Scott crawled into the bed, he was sobbing, and he said, "I just killed Missy."
She comforted and consoled Scott, and they got up later in the morning and continued their Sunday as if nothing had happened.
Of course, after she hears the news that Missy's really dead, she knows, holy crap, Missy's dead, and he just confessed to me.
Eve tells detectives her first impulse was to protect Scott, until she realizes he took her car and her gun and might be framing her.
So one of the things Scott asked Eve to do once he's returned back to her house in Lewisburg is to clean up her car. Unknowingly to her, he had used it that night to go kill Missy.
The statement from Eve concerning the mud in the car was significant because of the mud found inside the home of Missy Atkins. The investigators had to determine whether or not her story now was truthful.
To get that final nail in the coffin, so to speak, we need to get it from Scott.
But with Eve's story, armed with a warrant for his arrest, they go to haul him in.
But no one seemed to know where Scott was located.
We know he's capable of murder. One of the concerns was, is he going to try to just snatch Lucas and run?
In the brutal homicide of Missy Atkins, police are hunting for their lead suspect, her ex-boyfriend Scott Reynolds, who is on the lam.
He's trying to get away. He's trying to get out of Murfreesboro and Rutherford County.
To reach Scott, detectives enlist the help of his girlfriend Eve Barker, who knows police have as good a case against her as they do against him.
The police ask Eve to place a call to Scott Reynolds in the presence of the police officers and have that call recorded, and she agreed.
So if we can get him talking about it, and not only is it going to help us with evidence against Scott, but this is conversation that's going to help exonerate Eve.
Please leave your name, number, and a short message. I will return your call as soon as possible.
Hey, it's me.
When Eve called Scott, there was no answer.
I was just calling to see what you've been doing. I'm getting really scared, and I just needed to talk to you.
Shortly thereafter, Scott called her back on a private line.
Hello?
Where are you at?
Can't tell you. I need to talk to you on another phone line.
Well, I don't have
Yeah, because
one.
your phone may be tapped.
Scott was very concerned whether or not he could trust Eve Barker.
I want to know that I can trust you. I'm scared the cops have gotten a hold of you, and they're using you to get me to come in.
And he was very close-mouthed about any details regarding the murder of Melissa Atkins. But Eve, tell Scott, you need to get this off of your chest. It will be such a relief of a burden.
I don't know what to do.
Well, why don't you just come in?
If I turn myself in, I'm going to jail, and I'll never see Liz again.
She says, I know you love Lucas, but children visit their parents in prison all the time. Scott then says not for killing their mother.
Eve's portraying to Scott, she's worried that she could go to jail herself.
I'm really scared. If you did use my gun, Dad could come back on board.
You can't get in trouble. You tell the truth. You tell the truth. You're nothing to worry about. You were secret the whole time. You don't have anything to worry about.
Why didn't you tell me I could change your mind?
I don't know.
So Scott reassures her that she has nothing to do with this. So that it helps us verify Eve's story. It takes her out of that suspect pool. But it also reinforces the fact that
still won't turn himself in.
And then Scott had a custody hearing coming up on December 26th. One of Scott's ultimate goals was to get custody of his son. So we were thinking Scott was going to show up at this hearing. So we're going to be ready.
On December 26th, 2007, Scott Reynolds arrives at the courthouse in Rutherford County for his son Lucas's custody hearing.
Detective Ralph Merzick and Detective Troy Hooker arrest him for the murder of Melissa Atkin.
And he went peacefully, not a bit of trouble.
Investigators are now able to piece together Missy Atkins' final 24 hours.
December the 15th, 2007, Scott Reynolds had the opportunity to gain access to the .32 caliber Llama pistol kept in Eve's bedroom.
Tanner went to bed at 1 o'clock. Everyone's asleep. Scott decides he's going to take Eve's car to Missy's.
Scott Reynolds entered the home of Melissa Atkin. Missy was surprised by Scott Reynolds after throwing Missy to the bed and tying her hands securely behind her back. Scott Reynolds shot Missy Atkin in the back of the head 4 times.
At that time, Scott left her on the bed, removed her pants so that it indicated it was some sort of crime of a sexual nature, and then left the scene.
Scott Reynolds was concerned about what he wanted. He thought that the most important thing in the world was for things to go his way, and he did whatever he had to have total control concerning Missy and Lucas.
Scott, to me, is an intimate terrorist. This is someone who's incredibly callous and self-motivated, somebody who doesn't have a conscience. Scott wanted to regain custody, but more than that, he wanted revenge.
In July of 2008, Scott Reynolds is found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Eve Barker was never charged with having anything to do with Missy Atkins' murder.
The timeline in this case was one of the central pieces of evidence. It had to be established that he had not only the motive, but the opportunity to commit the crime.
In the eyes of the law, Mrs. family got justice. He's not going to be getting out of jail. He's in there for the rest of his life. But Scott can rot in hell. In my eyes, he's a sorry piece of shit for killing Luke's mom. Pardon the language.
It is ironic and sad. Scott Reynolds murdered Lucas's mother on the weekend intended to be a celebration of Lucas's birthday. But Scott Reynolds was not concerned about Lucas and certainly was not concerned about Missy.
Following the trial, Missy's parents, Linda and Doug Atkin, get custody of their grandson, Lucas.
When we lost Missy, we lost this amazing being a mother more than anything else in the world. I lost my best friend forever. Someone that is irreplaceable.
On Lucas's 19th birthday, he appeared before the same judge who had tried and convicted Scott Reynolds and asked that his name be changed to Lucas Atkin. The judge granted Lucas's request. It was a very special day.
I believe in my heart of hearts that Missy is so proud of who Lucas has become. She was and is and always will be an angel.
It was clear that whoever committed the crime was known to her and was allowed in by her.
Her career was blossoming.
This is my cubicle, my computer.
She loved life, loved her family. She really was effervescent. She was quite special.
Had all the hallmarks of a frenzied assault with multiple strikes and a lot of bloodshed. It seemed to me like it was a rage killing.
The letter that he read at the memorial service stated, "If I killed Lisa." It was very, very strange. The perpetrator stayed in the house for over 30 hours, and approximately 2 feet of hair was cut and taken.
Removing her hair would have just intensified the killer's obsessive tendencies, the need to own her, even in death.
It was 13 years since the homicide, and then they said, "We have a perfect match." We finally got the guy.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and the killer. San Francisco, California, sparkles with color and diversity. And in the late 1990s, the upscale neighborhood of Diamond Heights is one of the city's crown jewels.
San Francisco is bustling in '98, and one of the reasons people move to Diamond Heights is to see the expansive view of the city from above. There's a panoramic view of the bay. It was considered a very safe neighborhood, no major crimes like you might find in the Tenderloin or downtown San Francisco.
On a late spring morning, with the city enveloped in a layer of fog, an alarming call comes into 911 from an upscale condominium complex.
The manager of one of the buildings in Diamond Heights Village noticed that foul odor coming from condominium 307. The manager found the door unlocked, opened the door, and saw what appeared to be a deceased individual.
It would be a fair assumption to say that he realized something was terribly wrong. He immediately called the police. Police and paramedics arrived at the scene at 12:20 p.m., and upon entering, they found a female on the floor. It was immediately obvious to the first responders that this was a homicide.
The victim is the owner of the condo, 36-year-old computer programmer Lisa Valdez.
Lisa worked in the...
Yeah, type on the little computer. Lisa Valdez was born in San Francisco. She loved life, loved her family. She really was effervescent. She was quite special.
Inspectors Pam Hofsis and Ronan Schuldeis from the San Francisco Police Department's homicide detail are called in to investigate.
When you're in such close proximity, knowing that this person has been violently murdered, you can really not stop that video reel in your mind, imagining the sequence of events. Crime scenes, they will reveal some of the story themselves. Lisa's body was left in a position that you could only describe as being extremely undignified. Her shirt was pulled up around her neck. Her underwear appeared to have been torn off and were on the floor beside her. She had a number of stab wounds. It was really difficult to discern any wounds or pattern of wounds given that there was a degree of decomposition already underway. It appeared that she had been deceased for a period of a few days.
If you look at the crime scene, it seems that there was a very angry outburst. The way the mattress is located is very odd. It appears that the victim was stabbed on the bed and then pulled off the mattress onto the floor.
In this case, the blood at the scene tells us a lot. When you see a lot of high-velocity spatter, this suggests that someone is being struck or stabbed with tremendous speed and force, and it's casting blood a great distance. It suggests that this is very much a frenzied attack, some kind of crime of passion.
To solve Lisa Valdez's murder, detectives will need to reconstruct the final 24 hours of her life.
There was a bed which was in disarray with a large quantity of blood.
Blood all over, basically. The mattress is soaked, the bedding is soaked. So maybe it was a sexual encounter gone bad.
The injuries were clearly the result of stabbing using some kind of weapon, given the degree of bloodshed. The working assumption was that it was an edged weapon, a knife of some sort.
Detectives collect all the bedding for testing, hoping some of the blood belongs to Lisa's killer.
Particularly in an edged weapon attack, where there's often a high likelihood that the assailant will likewise injure himself or herself.
If you stab someone repeatedly, your fatty palm of your hand is made with your palm as you're stabbing someone.
Inspectors continue processing the crime scene, looking for answers.
Beside Lisa's body on the carpet, there was also a broken glass. This broken glass, perhaps it may have been held by her assailant. There was a phone beside the bed with the receiver knocked off the base. There was blood on it. Everything was collected for both DNA and for latent fingerprints.
Investigators collect Lisa's computer, agenda, and answering machine, hoping they'll offer up clues on who might have wanted to kill her.
We collect these items, attempting to establish recent contacts and activity.
If you looked at her calendar, almost every hour of every single day was filled with some event or celebration, either a date or a gym workout, Hawaiian dance class. I mean, she did it all. So she was very, very active.
Then the search continued throughout the rest of the condominium. The bathroom became an area of focus because it seemed clear to me that the assailant had spent some time in. Most significantly to me, the toilet seat was in the raised position.
Lisa lives alone. Most women don't leave a toilet seat up. We don't go to the bathroom that way.
We recovered a partial latent fingerprint consistent with where an individual's fingers may go underneath to raise it into the up position. Other surfaces also yielded prints or partial prints, all of which were collected.
New questions emerged as investigators work their way through Lisa's condo.
At the scene, you have to look at everything. Was this a burglary gone wrong? There was nothing to indicate that somebody had, either before or after the homicide, searched through Lisa's unit looking for valuables. It was a very secure building. You had to be admitted or to have codes to access the building. There was a door viewer in the door which would allow her to see who was outside.
There's no sign of forced entry. It was clear that whoever committed the crime was known to her and was allowed in by Lisa Valdez.
Having determined that Lisa has likely been deceased for several days, inspectors turn to her neighbors, hoping to narrow down her window of death.
Downstairs neighbors report that they heard a commotion at around 1:26 in the morning of Sunday, May 17th. It could be as she's being pulled off the mattress and lands on the floor. It could be when she's being stabbed to death.
Based on this new information, inspectors believe that Lisa was likely murdered around 1:26 a.m. and build a profile of the killer.
The medical examiner noted a total of 21 stab wounds to the face, the neck, and the chest. They also noted that the aorta was severed, which explains the amount of blood on the mat and the bedding. And they also noted defensive wounds on her hands, so she probably opened her hands up for self-defense.
With all the hallmarks of a frenzied assault, multiple strikes, and a lot of bloodshed.
21 separate stab wounds is overkill. The fact that most of these horrific stab wounds are concentrated around Lisa's face and chest tells me that this was not only intensely personal, but that this was someone who wanted to absolutely erase her, not only kill her. And there is some type of possessive, obsessive, and often sexual underlying motive.
Because of the degradation of DNA, the medical examiner couldn't prove that there was also a rape involved. But again, she was left in a position that would be consistent with some kind of a sexual assault, most likely post-mortem.
The medical examiner makes another important discovery. Lisa's hair appears to have been crudely cut, most likely post-mortem, as there are no lacerations to her scalp.
The fact that Lisa is found with her hair cut off, this is something that's fantasy or ritualistic driven because cutting someone's hair is not required for commission of this crime. It could very well be that the killer is motivated to have a piece of her always with him.
Inspectors receive the crime lab reports, and the initial findings don't yield any DNA results. Fingerprint analysis also comes up empty. But then, they receive a potential new lead.
In one particular area, on one of the pillowcases, there were a couple of drops that caught the attention of the crime lab. They felt very optimistic that it could be the assailant's blood. And it wasn't.
We found a mixture of two different DNAs on the pillow. One was Lisa Valdez and one was an unknown male profile. This blood droplet was a major breakthrough for the case. That DNA profile needs to be matched to somebody because he must be the killer.
In the brutal murder of 36-year-old computer programmer Lisa Valdez, investigators have their first big break. they have found male DNA, possibly from her killer.
I personally hand-delivered a small little tube of DNA extract from this droplet on Lisa's pillow that revealed a known male profile to the state DNA crime lab. Now, 1998, early DNA methods took a lot of time, but they uploaded it to the database, which was
leads or potential suspects. Inspectors turn to Lisa's mother, Helen Valdez, hoping she can fill out her daughter's timeline.
Helen and Lisa were very, very close. They spent a lot of time together. They would talk almost every day. It was very, very painful for Helen to lose her daughter and not know why someone would do that. It was just a real heartbreak for her, as for any parent.
Investigators ask Helen Valdez about her last contact with Lisa and learn they saw each other just a few hours before Lisa was likely killed.
Lisa's mother said that on Saturday, May 16th, Lisa entertained her mother and some friends at a dinner party. Most of the other guests were leaving at about 11 p.m. Helen stays on Lisa for another little while and left around midnight or 12 a.m. on Sunday, May 17th.
Helen Valdez also reveals a crucial detail about her daughter's appearance.
As part of the autopsy, the medical examiner noted that her hair was shoulder length, and when that information was shared with the family, the response was Lisa's pride and joy was her hair.
They called it, I believe, her crowning glory. It was her signature. Helen said that she would never have cut her hair.
2 feet of her hair, her prized possession, is taken. That is what's known as a token. This adds to the fact that the person who committed the crime knew Lisa because they would have known that her hair was really a big part of her life.
It would imply that there is a fixation, or there is something beyond just the violence involved.
The killer cutting her hair could be a way of humiliating her. It could be a way of sending a message that I'm attacking you and I'm attacking your sexuality and your femininity. Maybe I want to take this to also possess you. Maybe he wants a memento or a trophy that he can use for his own purposes.
By removing her hair, it would have just intensified the killer's obsessive tendencies, the need to own her, even in death.
Inspectors ask Helen Valdez if there are any men in Lisa's life who might match the profile of a man who is obsessed with her.
Helen said that Lisa had told her during the dinner party that she had a date with somebody new the following day on Sunday, May 17th. Helen did not know who this individual was. That became a potentially interesting lead because she perhaps had received a visit from him prematurely and let him into her apartment. Trying to find this individual rapidly became the focus of the investigation.
Then results come in from the analysis of Lisa.
Computer forensics investigators determined that at approximately 12:10 a.m. on Sunday, May 17th, Lisa was updating her own website, which would have been shortly after her mother Helen had left around midnight.
Her computer was then abruptly shut down without logging off or anything like that at 1:30 in the morning.
So as we examine the timeline, given the loud noise at about 1:26 a.m., and then you look at the improper shutdown of Lisa's computer at 1:30 a.m., it would suggest that the dynamics had shifted within her apartment at that time.
The theory is that it could have been the perpetrator that either just shut it down or unplugged it.
The investigation also reveals that at 2:50 a.m., a call comes in to Lisa's landline, which is unanswered. This call is received by the answering machine.
The caller identifies himself as Kevin Duvall.
Kevin states, "Hi Lisa, hi sweetie, I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to make the date today. Talk to you soon. Thanks, bye." We needed to find Kevin.
Then the investigation gets another boost when Lisa's housekeeper comes forward with new information.
The housekeeper comes every Monday to clean Lisa's condo, but on Monday, May 18th at around 10 in the morning, she gets to Lisa's condo, opens the door, and sees Lisa on the floor and a gym bag on one side, and she hears a male voice and says, "Oh, I don't want to interrupt. I'll come back next week." And she quickly closes the door. So That led to investigators to think the perpetrator stayed in the house for over 30 hours. He was there after midnight on Sunday, May 17th through Monday at 10 a.m. How scary is that? That he was able to stay that long is kind of disturbing and unusual. We're not sure what he could have possibly been doing that entire time.
In the sadistic killing of Lisa Valdez, homicide investigators have learned that the young woman's murderer likely stayed with her dead body for more than 30 hours.
Theory is that she's murdered on May 17th at almost 1:30, early hours of Sunday morning. And so thanks to the housekeeper's account of timeline, he's still there Monday morning, May 18th at 10. At this point, we're still struggling to connect the dots, so this just confounds the investigation and adds to the complexity of what's going on.
It merits noting that Lisa's killer spent over 24 hours with her body post-mortem. Suggests a number of things. We know, for instance, that convicted objects to be possessed and experimented with, it ups the ante in terms of how dangerous this person is.
Investigators need to determine if there's a connection between the phone message left for Lisa by Kevin Duvall at 2:52 a.m. and her murder.
The phone call on her answering machine is from a payphone.
The content of the message was a young man who had to cancel a date for later on that afternoon. Certainly the possibility would exist that if this individual called at that time, he could conceivably be attempting to create some kind of an alibi position for himself if he was involved.
The fact that Lisa had a date planned with some mystery man after she was murdered, and this guy Kevin had canceled that date around 2 in the morning, this in itself is inherently suspicious.
Inspectors look into Kevin Duvall and discover his phone number in Lisa's address book.
We're looking for anyone who had any issues with Lisa, that maybe was passionately in love with her, that she didn't accept. Kevin comes into the station to provide a statement regarding the last contact he had with Lisa.
Investigators found that Kevin Duvall, during their interview, was behaving very nervously. And he had advised the police that he had met Lisa through a recruiting center where the two were looking for work. Their friendship then developed and blossomed.
In Kevin's statement, he mentioned that the reason he canceled the date with Lisa on that Sunday was he wasn't feeling well, and he just wanted to give her a heads up and let her know in the middle of the night that that was the case.
As detectives continue to question Kevin, they observe something suspicious.
Please note that on Kevin's hand, he has this laceration that is consistent with the types of wounds obtained unintentionally by offenders who stab a victim. It's very difficult to repeatedly stab someone with most knives and not sustain some kind of incidental self-injury. This immediately is going to raise some red flags.
The cut could indicate that he was the perpetrator because we know that blood was dripped onto the pillow after the stabbing.
When inspectors ask about his whereabouts in the early hours of Sunday, May the 17th, Kevin's alibi is that he was home alone.
When you're alone, you have no one to witness that you're alone. This was before GPS and surveillance cameras, and so there was nobody who could substantiate his being home alone. Kevin becomes the prime suspect because there's no real alibi, and he did have a cut on his hand. We're thinking if he has a cut on his hand, he must be the killer.
We would request that he provide DNA samples, and
Kevin agrees to take a polygraph exam. His polygraph was inconclusive, which means that they couldn't say without a doubt that he was telling the whole truth.
But when the forensic results come in, they are conclusive.
The results eliminate him and exclude him as a source of the blood on the pillow, fingerprint-wise and DNA-wise. So Kevin could not have been the killer.
With their prime suspect eliminated, investigators are still left with the DNA of an unknown male killer, and not much else.
Lisa knows her killer, and this is probably someone who has obsessed over her. Maybe he's been rejected, and he moves from rejected to resentful. The more he ruminates on this, the more potentially his violence increases. So this obsession turns deadly.
This guy is really a cornucopia of high-risk sexual preoccupations, all of which points to a disordered but obsessive mind.
Officers interviewed like 50 people at least. Every person that they've interviewed, every person that they sampled is hitting a dead end, and that's very frustrating.
Inspectors circle back to Lisa's mother, Helen, to see if there's anyone else who comes to mind who fits the profile of the killer.
We came across one potential suspect, Gary, who they were very interested in.
According to Lisa's friends, they dated in the past, maybe 1 or 2 dates. He was very much into her, and she was not into him. And so that piqued the interest for the investigation, because now we're talking about unrequited love and possible jealousy.
Helen Valdez hadn't thought much of Gary Walker before the murder, but recent events have raised her suspicion.
There was a memorial service for Lisa, and Gary read a letter out loud to everyone that was very unusual and scary, I guess is the right word. The letter that he read at the memorial service stated, "If I killed Lisa." It also stated he would have never done that because he loved her so much. It was really bizarre and very, very strange. People were surprised and taken aback.
Gary's disturbing poem reading. I mean, this is someone who is a little too preoccupied with Lisa. This to me speaks of a certain degree of obsession, even of obsessive fantasy.
He literally becomes the prime suspect with that information.
In the gruesome murder of 36-year-old Lisa Valdez, inspectors are zeroing in on a new suspect, Gary Walker, a man she once dated who developed a twisted obsession with her.
This prime suspect read at the memorial service that stated, "If I killed Lisa." We have bizarre behavior from this individual. She definitely was not interested, and so he murdered her. That's the theory, right? And that's quite possible. That's why she's dead.
With suspicion swirling around Gary Walker, detectives haul him into the station for questioning.
Gary says he's very close to Lisa. He's a good friend of hers, and that he considered Lisa his soulmate. He would never do any kind of harm to her at all.
Investigators drill down on Gary's timeline in the hours leading up to Lisa's murder.
According to Gary's statement, he was with friends on the evening of May 16th, Saturday, and then after midnight on Sunday morning, he was at home asleep alone in his apartment. But there was nobody who could substantiate his being home alone and asleep and not having anything to do with this murder at the time. A DNA swab is collected from Gary, and fingerprints are collected so that we can compare it to the latent fingerprints from the toilet seat and the DNA evidence from the pillow that we have from the crime scene.
Investigators also obtain search warrants for Gary's home and vehicle.
He is the prime suspect. And when they search Gary's house, they find evidence of his infatuation with Lisa. There are pictures and letters and mementos of Lisa all over.
When police search his residence, they find a shrine to Lisa. Photographs intermingled with pornography, and essentially all things Lisa that suggest Gary was beyond obsessed.
The homicide inspectors felt that he may be indeed her murderer.
Police seize plenty of incriminating evidence, but while all of it plays to the profile of an obsessed killer, nothing from Gary's home comes back with Lisa's DNA.
Nothing had blood drips on it. There's no evidence that took something from the scene and brought it back to his house. There's no evidence that we could tie it to the crime scene. So there's no proof that he committed the crime.
But with no one able to verify Gary's alibi, inspectors ask him to submit to a polygraph test.
They definitely thought he was going to fail the polygraph and confess to the murder. That was their hope, and it didn't pan out that way. They subject Gary to a couple of polygraphs. They come back inconclusive each and every time.
The only remaining avenue of investigation into Gary is the forensics.
The fingerprints eliminate Gary from the crime scene, And so then it's a matter of getting the DNA results in. Could have been the breakthrough, and it wasn't. We're still at a dead end. We don't have any other information about who committed this crime.
The investigation essentially hits the wall.
Over the course of several months, investigators obtain and test the DNA of dozens of other men in Lisa's address book and list of caller IDs.
We were still receiving from the homicide inspectors a series of potential candidates for comparison against the fingerprints collected from the crime scene. At least a dozen sets of prints were submitted to CSI for comparison against that, and every one of them was negative.
We've already eliminated so many of the contacts through interviewing and testing, also contacting people she has dated or her ex-boyfriends, and everybody's eliminated. There's no evidence of who might have committed the crime.
Months turn to years, and the case grows cold, and stays cold for more than a decade.
The thing that stuck out for me was that this gal, she lived on her own, she was self-sufficient, she was independent, she loved life. I related to a lot of that, and so I saw myself in her, and I saw the way she was brutally murdered. I actually had the DNA profile in a chart on my desk, and every time a case came up and we had a reference sample come in for violent crime, I would look at that profile to see if there was a match. And year after year, I would call the state lab and just ask them to conduct a quick search of that profile that's already in CODIS and still not a match.
I left that fingerprint from the crime scene on my desk, where it remained for years. It was a constant reminder that there was still an unidentified fingerprint within that case file.
Lisa's murder is a case that, beginning to end, lends itself to obsession. We have a very malicious obsession of her killer and some other people in her life, but then we have the very benevolent and virtuous obsession of the police, who will never let this case go.
Then Pam Hofsis attends a conference for homicide detectives, where she learns how popular familial DNA sites can be used to solve crimes.
Instead of looking for an exact, perfect DNA match, we look for a partial match. In other words, if there's a relative, like a brother, a son, or father, biologically, they're going to have very similar genetic information as the DNA profile, and if they would be in the database, then we could backtrack and do research on the back end to see if any of those relatives were in the area or available, let's say, to commit that crime. When I got back, I told my lieutenant at the time, we got to do a familial search on Lisa Valdez.
Investigators hope the killer's DNA they found on the pillowcase. Inspector Hofsis gains new information that breaks the case wide open.
I got a call from the state lab, and they said, we always do one last CODIS search before we do a familial. And they said, we did one last search, and your guy was just arrested and finally sampled for DNA and entered into the DNA database. We have a perfect match. Finally, this is the guy.
The previously unidentified male who left his DNA at the crime scene has been recently arrested in San Francisco on a shoplifting charge. His name is Anthony Quinn Hughes.
Anthony Quinn Hughes had never come up in the course of the original investigation, and he was not on the radar. Now, this individual was arrested, and he was finally swabbed as a felony arrest, and that's how it connected to the unknown DNA profile that was hovering and waiting for someone to finally match. 13 years since the homicide of Lisa Valdez, and it was just an amazing feeling. I couldn't wait to figure out where this guy was and get him in custody for Lisa's murder.
13 years after the murder of Lisa Valdez, police match her killer's DNA from the scene to a man named Anthony Quinn Hughes, caught shoplifting in San Francisco's Tenderloin neighborhood.
At that time, I'm contacted by Inspector Pam Hofsis in a state of great excitement, and I think her opening line may have been, "You won't believe it." Now, Anthony Hughes actually had fingerprints on file, and she wanted me to compare the fingerprint from the toilet seat against this set of prints. I did that, and later the same day I was able to return the compliment by telling her it's him. I felt like celebrating, frankly. It was a big day.
Now 52 years old, Anthony Hughes would have been in his late 30s at the time of Lisa's murder. Investigators returned to the case files, looking for a connection to Lisa.
His name never came up in any of the conversations with the friends of Lisa or the family, but further review of the original case files showed that he was in her address book and he was on her answering machine.
With DNA and fingerprint matches, inspectors obtain an arrest warrant for Anthony Quinn Hughes.
The challenge for us was to try to locate him since he didn't have any known address through our database records. We just knew where he was arrested most recently. The idea was that he had to be from that area.
Within 24 hours of that warrant being issued, Mr. Hughes jaywalked in front of a police car and was recognized and was taken into custody.
Kind of disheveled and appeared homeless, but he's very friendly and outgoing.
Inspectors show Anthony a photograph of Lisa Valdez.
When we first show him the photo of Lisa, he says he doesn't know her. Slowly but surely, through the course of the interrogation, he admitted that he knew Lisa from high school, that they dated for a little bit. He was 17, she was 16. He definitely felt like Lisa's mom did not approve of him, and then he moved on and got married and had children and that kind of thing. And then I said, well, when's the last time you had contact with her? And he said something like the late 80s. And he talked about how he had met her jogging around Lake Merritt in Oakland, which is across the bay. And we know she was going to school at a college right there. So that was plausible. And then he talked about how he hadn't seen her since then, which we knew was not true. The late 90s, he was in Lisa's address book. His name, his address, his phone number, etc.
Inspectors press Anthony for details about what happened the last time he saw Lisa.
He wasn't forthcoming, but he said he bumped into her in Oakland. He said she took him to her dorm room and, made some off-the-cuff comment about how many guys she slept with back in that day. His whole demeanor just really angry and worked up, and he kept saying, I don't understand why she would do that, on and on and on. It was really kind of eye-popping.
When Anthony says this, I don't think he necessarily realizes how that comment about how many partners Lisa has is so unusual, and why it would be unusual that this is something that he's fantasizing and thinking about. And so it's been all-consuming. It's leaking out, even in the course of this questioning.
Detectives then confront Anthony Hughes with the fact they found his DNA at the scene of Lisa's murder.
He denied being in her condo. So we asked him, how do you explain your DNA and your fingerprints there? And he could not provide an explanation at all. He said, I want to die. Repeatedly, I want to die. And then he did something pretty spectacular. My partner and I were looking at each other like, okay, so now he's going to confess. But he took the pen and he started to write out what we assumed was going to be a confession. Instead, he took the pen and started to stab himself.
No, don't do that. Don't do that.
Which is a form of admission, in a sense.
After 13 years, inspectors are finally able to piece together the final 24 hours of Lisa Valdez's life.
Lisa and Anthony had some form of relationship back in the day, and years later somehow reconnected. He was upset that she had boyfriend Lisa.
He was so besotted with her, and he was rejected.
In the early morning of Sunday, May 17th, 1998, Anthony finally decides to visit Lisa and confess his feelings.
It appears that Anthony made contact at Lisa's condo complex sometime after midnight, and he had to have been buzzed in by Lisa.
Some type of confrontation erupts between the two of them.
He was somebody who fixated on her, who didn't take no for an answer, who was rebuffed and reacted with a rage, and it starts to unravel pretty quickly.
We can assume Anthony takes the knife and stabs her repeatedly.
The fact that her underwear had been torn away suggested strongly that there was a sexual element to this homicide.
So she's struggling with him, trying to get him to stop stabbing her at around 1:26 in the morning when the downstairs neighbors heard a commotion, and then she's murdered.
It was a rage killing.
After After Anthony kills Lisa, he stays with her body for up to 30 hours.
At some point, he takes a token of her hair. He cuts her hair at least 2 feet. And at some point, he cleaned up in the bathroom. And I would assume that once the housekeeper came by on Monday, May 18th at around 10 in the morning, he might have thought that police would be coming right after it, and he hightailed it.
It's possible that Anthony was a sexual sadist given the amount of time that was reported that he spent with Lisa's body and that he has stabbed her numerous times. And he's taken her hair. He's exerting his dominance over her. Maybe in some ways this could almost be a revenge or vengeful fantasy where he's actively been fantasizing about committing this aggressive act towards Lisa.
In the heinous killing of Lisa Valdez, Anthony Quinn Hughes is found guilty of second-degree murder and is sentenced to 16 years to life.
There may still be a few unanswered questions as to the root of why, but the combined behaviors, timelines, and evidence, when put together, leaves you at a place where there's no other conclusion you can come to. And that was Anthony Hughes, who is responsible for the murder of Lisa Valdez.
That was a really satisfying moment for all of us and for her family. That's all you can hope for. Some glimmer of relief. That's why you do this job. To just give families some measure of closure and finality.
Lisa's case, at the end of the day, was solved through a combination of just dogged, shoe-leather detective work, as well as the understanding of the importance of preserving evidence, like DNA, for the son.
20 years. Lisa continues to live on in the memories of her family and the many friends whose lives she touched.
She was a force to be reckoned with. Everyone loved her. She just really had a love of life, and I admired that. And I just felt like, how could you take her out like that? You know, brutal, senseless. And those are the kinds of cases that stick with you as a homicide detective.
She had a lot to bring to the world, and you could see her personality. And she was energetic and funny, very outgoing, and I felt kind of privileged in a way to get that glimpse of her. And I know that's how her family remember her, and now it's how I remember her too.
This is a chaotic, violent scene, suggesting this was planned, premeditated, and personal.
There were stab wounds all over her body.
This was a brutal murder.
She was a faithful woman, a loving, caring mother and grandmother, and didn't deserve to die.
She was probably targeted, but this is an elderly lady. Why this person? Why this house? This is so far off the beaten path.
They stood to be the beneficiary of $5 million. It's an enormous incentive for them to collect on those policies as soon as possible.
He calls repeatedly, saying, when is she going to die? When is she going to die?
She was just a payday. They had to hasten the death to realize their fantasies of greed.
The person looks just like the person that was seen at the crime scene. This could be the killer.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. Colleyville, Texas, combines old Southern charm with modern-day luxury.
Colleyville is an affluent, suburban bedroom community that's situated between Dallas and Fort Worth.
There's a lot of money in Colleyville. It's high-end homes. Not just anyone can afford a house there.
I could count on my hands how many crimes that we have.
There hasn't been a murder in Colleyville in over 30 years.
But on a warm fall morning, 911 receives a call that shatters this peaceful community's sense of safety.
Number 1 person murder. I just got here to this house when I saw the blood, and I saw that lady dead in the floor with blood all over the place. Could you tell if she was breathing? Okay, hold on just a moment. I need you to get out of the house. Okay?
Police officers arrived on scene and they found the gardener and that she was hysterical. She told them that she found the housekeeper laying on the floor inside of the house, laying in blood. The detectives saw a woman on the walls.
They noted that there were stab wounds all over her body and appeared to be blunt force trauma to the head.
It looked like that she may have had some type of defensive wounds on her arms. This was a brutal murder.
There's also slices through her clothes over top of where the stab wounds occurred, suggesting some kind of edged weapon like a knife, but there is no murder weapon to be found.
The victim is identified as the housekeeper who worked at the residence, 69-year-old Anita Fox.
Anita Fox lived in Alvarado, Texas. She lived in a mobile home park. She was a mother and a grandmother.
Miss Fox had 3 children. There was Virginia, her oldest daughter, Al Fox III, her youngest son, and her daughter Jenna, her husband, had passed away some years earlier. Anita was big in her church. She doted over her grandchildren, and that was what her life was all about.
Heading up the investigation into Anita Fox's murder are Hillary Ray of the Colleyville Police Department and FBI Special Agent Ron Grossi.
After so many years of not having a murder in Colleyville, and this is the first one we've had, my first thought was, why this person? Why this house? This is so far off the beaten path. This is an elderly lady. These types of things just don't typically happen in Colleyville.
The state of Anita's body suggests a frenzied attack. This is a chaotic, violent scene, therefore suggesting this was planned, premeditated, and likely it was personal.
To catch Anita Fox's killer, investigators will have to piece together her final 24 hours.
Based on the blood patterns and how fresh the body seems to investigators, detectives deduce that the murder happened pretty recently, not far from when the gardener called the police at 11:26 a.m.
With a preliminary window of death established, investigators begin processing the crime scene.
When we searched the house, it doesn't look like there was any type of a burglary. It didn't look like anything had been gone through. There is no forced entry. The rest of the house was in order. Evidence technicians, they were looking for DNA, any type of blood transfer, anything that may be left at the crime scene location.
Then, property owners Frank and Nancy Lopez arrive home.
Nancy was very distraught. She said that Miss Fox had worked with them for several years, was a trusted worker of theirs. Miss Fox comes to her house every 2 weeks. On Tuesday, would be able to let herself in. Nancy didn't have any clue as to why somebody would do this.
Detectives bring the gardener, Benita Garcia, the woman who discovered Anita's body, down to the station for questioning.
She told the investigators that she arrived at the property approximately 11:10 a.m. At approximately 11:15 to 11:25, she noticed that there was a truck sitting in front of the home. She was sitting in a parked car a house or two away from the residence, and she noticed a man exiting the residence sometime between 11:15 and 11:25 a.m.
Benita described him as a short, fat man, and he was a white male with white or gray hair. And he was carrying a orange bucket, kind of like a painter's bucket. She said that he walked down the road a little bit and got into a pickup truck. When Benita saw the white male exit the house, she immediately got suspicious because typically the Lopezes would tell her if a handyman or somebody would be at the house.
She observed what appeared to her to be a younger, skinnier man in the driver's side of the vehicle.
The vehicle involved was a Chevrolet. It had ladder racks on it, more like what a workman's truck would look like. Police asked her if she was able to get a license plate, and this is not something that she observed.
Once Benita told us about the man leaving the house, we automatically thought that this could be the killer.
The fact that Benita saw this mystery man leave the house sometime between 11:15 and 11:25 a.m. suggests that the murder occurred probably at that time. Also, Benita tells detectives that this mystery man's features are distinctive enough that she would recognize him if she saw him again.
Investigators set Benita up with a forensic sketch artist, hoping they'll create a likeness of the person they believe to be Anita's killer.
So at this point in the investigation, they do have a sketch of somebody who was seen leaving the scene. If we can find who this person is, maybe this leads to the killer.
One of our theories was that Anita was probably targeted. I felt that it was personal because it was just very violent.
Still, police don't know about Anita. What else was going on in her life? What people had infiltrated her life that may have, unbeknownst to her, posed a danger to her?
We just didn't know. At this point, it was a real whodunit.
69-year-old Anita Fox. Detectives are building their case around a police sketch of a man observed leaving the crime scene moments after the murder. To find out more about who might have wanted to kill the elderly housekeeper, investigators turn to her family, starting with her son, Al Fox.
Miss Fox's son, Al Fox, is just completely distraught. He described his mother as just the sweetest person, and he was just in complete shock.
Anita Fox appeared to be closer to him than the other children because the other children lived out of state. And Al Fox lived near her in the RV park.
Al said they had a good relationship, even though at the time she didn't have a lot of money and she was happy.
While talking about his mother's background, Al Fox reveals their family is part of a tight-knit, nomadic traveler community.
Traveler communities, they are spread out throughout the United States, mostly in the southeast. They travel across the country from town to town trying to find work. Typically blue-collar construction type jobs, but they'll return to their home base. Often the businesses that they conduct are legitimate, but sometimes they're not. So they keep their culture and their work and marriages within their own group.
Detectives ask Al if he can think of anyone who might have wanted to hurt his mother.
Al described his mother as a loving, church-going lady who had no enemies. So when asked about a motive, Al believed that the only motive could be that he thought that she had $1 million life insurance policy.
In the traveler community, it's very common for them to take out life insurance policies on their elderly relatives in hopes that when their loved ones die, that they will receive a windfall for that.
Life insurance is often investigated as a possible motive because the beneficiary of the policy typically has a financial incentive for that person to die. In this case, the beneficiaries would more than likely be the children.
Believing Al and his two siblings could stand to cash in on a $1 million life insurance policy, detectives ask him about his timeline leading up to his mother's death.
Al Fox said he last saw his mother the night before she was murdered. She came over and visited him at his house. And as he often did, he called her to make sure she got home all right. On the morning of September 23rd, Al told them he was in the business of paving. He was on the job site, paving the parking lot from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. on that day.
Detectives know that Anita was killed sometime and witnessed the mystery man, who they believe to be the killer, exiting the house.
And Al Fox's colleagues verified that Al was indeed on the job site from 9 o'clock till noon, the day his mother was killed.
With Al ruled out, investigators show him a sketch of the man witnessed leaving the crime scene, who they believe is the killer.
Al said he did not recognize that person at all.
The investigators described the tan Chevrolet pickup with a ladder rack on it. And Al Fox says, wait a minute, I've seen that truck. Several days earlier, he was paving the parking lot of Texas Oncology. and his mother shows up on the job site. She brought him lunch. And Al notices a truck drive by. The people in the truck are kind of eyeballing him. And they drove by several times, and it raised concern, but not enough to do anything at that point.
Al Fox also saw the vehicle on September 20th, driving around the trailer park where he and his mother lived.
On September 21st, 2 days before the murder, he sees it at Big Willie's, which is a convenience store that's nearby.
Al said he tells his wife, "That's too many times. We've seen this truck too many times. Take a picture of that truck." So she takes a picture of the truck and the license plate.
The investigators were convinced that it was the same truck that was present at the murder scene.
Detectives were able to obtain surveillance video from the area and see the truck that Al described. This corroborated what he was saying, that this truck had been following him.
But the police were not able to make out the complete license plate. They were able to make out the last three numbers. Also, the police were not able to determine who the driver was of the truck that they observed on the security camera.
While police worked to track down the tan truck, Detective Ray and FBI Agent Grossi turned to another beneficiary of Anita's alleged $1 million life insurance policy, her estranged daughter, Jenna Lee, and her husband, Paul.
Jenna had some problems in the past with drug and alcohol abuse. In investigations that involve people who are drug and or alcohol abusers, they often have a financial motive in a crime because it takes money to pay for your habit. So a potential suspect who has drug problems would be of keen interest to the police.
Anita's relationship with Jenna Lee was strained, and Jenna had not spoken to Anita in months prior to the murder.
Life insurance policy.
Jenna had no idea that her mother might have had $1 million life insurance policy on her.
During the interview, we noticed that Paul had a scratch on his nose and also on his hands. One of our theories is that Anita was fighting back and scratched him on the face. So it immediately raised suspicion that he could have possibly been the murderer.
With suspicion cast on the couple, detectives ask about their whereabouts the day Anita was killed.
They had an alibi for the day that Anita Fox was killed. They were 1,000 miles away or so in Minnesota.
Investigators eliminate Jenna Lee and her husband as suspects and move on to the last potential beneficiary of Anita's supposed $1 million life insurance policy, her daughter Virginia and her husband Mark Buckland.
During the interview, Virginia described their relationship with Anita as wonderful. Great mother-daughter relationship, no problems.
They would talk to each other almost daily.
Police department asked if there was any insurance on Anita Fox.
I didn't know if your mother had an insurance policy or something for a burial or life insurance policy or anything like that.
No, I don't think she had it.
Virginia Buckland says no, there would be no insurance on my mother.
So Anita's son, Al, said that there was $1 million policy on Anita Fox, and Jenna and Virginia denied that. And so investigators in Colleyville didn't understand why there was a misunderstanding about that.
So when the investigators asked where Virginia and Mark were on the morning of September 23rd, they advised that they were both employed in Minnesota.
Investigators show Virginia and Mark the sketch of the man observed leaving the crime scene, whom they believe killed Anita.
The composite sketch of the man who came out of the house, it didn't ring any bells. They didn't recognize the sketch or the description of the truck. As the Bucklands were leaving, Mark Buckland pulled aside one of the investigators and told them that he had not been completely truthful when they asked him about life insurance on Anita Fox.
Mark Buckland says, I own a monster policy on my mother-in-law.
He said that Anita had $5 million worth of insurance on her life. Mark Buckland stressed with the investigators that while he and his wife may have been beneficiaries of these policies, they in no way were involved in her murder and that they loved Anita.
He claimed that the reason why he withheld it from the police was because he didn't want Al Fox to know. because they didn't want Al Fox to get any of the money.
Be the beneficiary of $5 million is an enormous incentive for them to collect on those policies as soon as possible, which would mean that Anita Fox had to die.
In the murder of 69-year-old Anita Fox, detectives have learned that her own daughter, Virginia Buckland, along with Virginia's husband, Mark, took out a life insurance policy on Anita worth $5 million. $5
million? That's a lot of money. It's a lot of money for anybody. It was a lot of money for the Bucklands. Now the focus was on the potential involvement of Virginia and Mark.
To help navigate the complexities of this case, detectives consult with Sergeant Randy Waters, an investigator with the Texas Department of Insurance.
When the police and the Texas Department of Insurance investigate the policies on Anita's life, they did confirm that the beneficiaries were Mark Buckland and or his wife, Virginia Buckland.
It's not enough to link them to the murder itself, but it's suspicious that they would have that much insurance on her, and here she is, murdered.
They also discovered that there were recorded phone calls to the insurance companies, supposedly by Anita Fox, talking about the life insurance policy.
Detectives invite Anita's son, Al Fox, down to the station to verify that Anita was in fact the one making those calls.
Detectives played back the recordings for Al, and Al told Detective Waters, "That's not my mother, that's Virginia."
Virginia pretending to be her mother, it's a red flag.
During my conversation with Al Fox, he told me about a situation in which he drove to his mother's home, and when he got there, he sees that his mother is talking to someone who he later determines to be Charles or Chuck Mercier. Chuck Mercier was an insurance agent out of South Carolina, and he was there to sell his mother insurance. And Al says, no way. He does not want his mother taking out insurance because, as he puts it, it puts a target on her. And he tells the guy, leave, get out of here.
Well, Al Fox was concerned about these life insurance policies because the member of their family had been murdered for the benefit of a policy.
When detectives reveal that Virginia and Mark are the sole beneficiaries of the $5 million life insurance policies, Al is stunned.
Al Fox was not aware of the $5 million of insurance on his mother's life.
Virginia and Mark are starting to look like they may be involved.
For the insurance payout, detectives question them again.
Mark and Virginia Buckland were being questioned about the fact that Virginia had impersonated her mother on a couple calls with the insurance company. Virginia assured them that her mother knew about the calls and that she knew about the $5 million of insurance.
They claimed that they had Anita's permission and that she just didn't have time to do it, and so she asked Virginia to do it for her.
Virginia and Mark Buckland told the investigators that the policies were applied through Charles Mercier. It was their story that Anita wanted more life insurance on herself for the benefit of her children and her grandchildren. So there was a total of 5 policies totaling $5 million written on the life of Anita Fox.
There was a challenge in making the payments. The premium increased from basically $3,000 to $6,000. Virginia realizes, hey, we cannot keep this going.
So Mark Buckland wanted to find out a way to lower the amount of premiums he was paying, which meant that he might have to let one of the policies go. Mercier thought that he could find a buyer, or quote, an investor, for one of the policies. And Charles Mercier was indeed able to locate a group of Irish travelers who were interested in purchasing one of the $1 million policies on Anita Fox's life. This is a group of investors whom Virginia and Mark Buckland said they had no knowledge of. They didn't know who they were. Since one of the policies now has a new beneficiary, that brings in a new suspect.
Could this mysterious group of policy buyers have something to do with the murder of Anita Fox? Looking for answers, investigators haul the insurance agent, Charles Mercier, down to the station for questioning.
Charles Mercier would sell to mainly travelers who were basically profiting from the death of their loved ones. Charles Mercier told us people in the traveler community want to buy policies that are on other people, even if they don't know them, in hopes that the person dies before they spend as much money as they spent on the premiums.
During the interview, he confirmed meeting with the Bucklands, but he did acknowledge that the application for the policies was fraudulent. Anita's net worth was grossly inflated. Her assets were made up.
The signatures that were on the transfer of the beneficiary documents were not Anita Fox's signature.
Mr. Mercier told us that Mark Buckland was having trouble paying all of the premiums for the $5 million.
Charles Mercier, there would be 3 other brothers also involved in the policy. Mike, Harry, and Gerard Big Joe Gorman. The Gormans are also part of the traveler community.
So Mercier arranged for the change of beneficiary on this policy to be made from Virginia Buckland to Patrick Gorman. But the beneficiary has to have a relationship with the insured. So since there was no relationship, Patrick Gorman did not know Anita Fox, didn't know the Bucklands. It was decided that Patrick Gorman would be portrayed as a business partner of Anita Fox.
The 4 brothers got together and said, okay, let's use Pat to own the policy, and then when Anita Fox passes away, he'll get the $1 million and he can divide it between the 4 of us. That was their plan. Charles Mercier told Pat Gorman that Anita Fox was only going to live for a year. So you buy this policy, pay $2,800 a month, and you're only going to have to worry about a year. She has a hole in her heart, and they don't expect her to live that long.
The Gormans had been paying premiums for a year, and they were concerned that they might be paying those high premiums for years to come.
One of the brothers, Gerard Big Joe Gorman, calls Mercier repeatedly, saying, when is she going to die? When is she going to die? What's going on?
Charles shared with the investigators that Big Joe Gorman had called him asking for Anita Fox's address.
He started asking, hey man, where's she live? I was like, I don't know. Really need to know that. He said, hey man, we're paying $700 a piece. What can you share?
These new revelations were extremely important. The revelation that there was now not only a new suspect in Patrick Gorman, but maybe 4 suspects in the 4 Gormans. And the fact that Gerard Gorman expressed that he might pay a visit to Anita Fox was extremely important. It is another red flag.
In this crime, you have a virulent mix of personality traits, a level of callousness and premeditation here. Perhaps Anita Fox was just a payday. Then they had to hasten the death to realize their fantasies of greed.
In the brutal homicide of loving grandmother Anita Fox, the focus of the investigation has shifted to the Gorman brothers, who shortly before Anita's murder purchased a $1 million life insurance policy on her.
The policies themselves, which were obtained fraudulently, were an incentive for the murder of Anita Fox. So they didn't rule out some type of involvement of Virginia and Mark Buckland, but there was more.
Who's named as the sole beneficiary of the $1 million policy.
Patrick has an address in Illinois. They spoke with Gorman's wife, Catherine. She informed him he was away out of state on a job.
But his wife was able to provide the police with a picture of Patrick. But the picture of Patrick Gorman was very different than the sketch of the suspect in Anita Fox's murder. Patrick Gorman appeared to be much thinner, younger than the composite drawing. And while he might not have been the man who murdered Anita Fox, the police did not rule out that he had something to do with it.
Detectives tracked down Patrick Gorman in Columbia, South Carolina.
Patrick Gorman acknowledged that he was the beneficiary of this policy, as set up by Charles Mercier. He acknowledged that he did not have a business relationship with Anita Fox. He told us that he had never been to Colleyville, didn't know Anita Fox, and had nothing to do with her murder. Patrick Gorman's alibi for the day that Anita Fox was murdered was he was in Texas, but he was there for the wedding of his son. So he had a lot of witnesses to verify that. So Patrick was eliminated as the one who committed the crime, but the other three brothers were not eliminated as potential assailants in the murder of Anita Fox.
With Patrick claiming no knowledge of the murder, detectives seek the whereabouts of his brothers. But like many in the Irish traveler community, they're elusive and seem to have disappeared.
This is the first that we had ever dealt with anyone in the traveler community, and when we started searching for names, we would get, pages of aliases. It's just hard to track them down and get a positive identification on them.
But then, investigators catch a break.
During the course of the investigation, the crime lab in Texas was able to digitally enhance the photograph that Al Fox's wife took of the license plate of the truck that had been following them in Colleyville. With that digital enhancement, they were able to see the entire license plate and determined that the plate on the truck was registered to a Bernard Gorman. Further investigation determined
who is registered the truck that was described at the crime scene. We knew we were on the right track.
Detectives also receive additional security footage from Big Willie's convenience store.
The investigators were able to determine that at 7:38 p.m. on September 21st, the truck that they had been attempting to find exited the vehicle.
The person looks just like the person that was in the sketch.
When they discovered these details, they immediately thought, we've got our prime suspect.
The Texas Rangers found the truck and they eventually executed a traffic stop and arrested Bernard Gorman.
The Texas Rangers impound the truck and bring Bernard Gorman to Colleyville for questioning.
When asked about the insurance policy on Anita Fox, Bernard Gorman said he had no knowledge of that. He did not know Anita Fox, never heard of her. He told the investigators he'd been nowhere near Colleyville on September 23rd, 2014.
Investigators pressed Bernard about how his truck ended up in Colleyville on the day of the crime.
Investigators told him they had photographs of the truck being in and around Colleyville on September 23rd.
At that point, he said that he had loaned his truck to his father.
He came to me Friday night and said, "Can I borrow your truck? I'm going to drive up to Tulsa."
You're saying you have no knowledge of what your dad did when he took your truck that week?
I don't know. I wasn't with him.
Okay, what's your dad's name?
Bernard says that his dad's name is Gerard Gorman. We were automatically suspicious. This is the brother who's been making threatening phone calls to Charles Mercier. In addition, Gerard Gorman could be the person that was also seen by the gardener at the crime scene.
The revelation was extremely important because Gerard was one of the four Gorman brothers who stood to benefit from the $1 million policy on Anita Fox. So Gerard Gorman and his son are now high on the list of suspects in the murder investigation. But they ask him if he knows where his father is. Bernard says he doesn't know where his father is and that his father doesn't have a cell phone, so he doesn't know how to get a hold of him. So while the investigators question Bernard Gorman's story, the police don't have enough evidence to hold Bernard. He doesn't match the description of the assailant, and they have no direct evidence that he was in Colleyville on the 23rd of September.
With Bernard Gorman released for now, investigators turn their attention to his father, Gerard Gorman.
They obtained a driver's license photograph from the Department of Motor Vehicles of Gerard Gorman and made a comparison between that photograph and the composite sketch that was made. The sketch was a very accurate depiction of Gerard Gorman.
The case against the Gormans gets an added boost when the forensics come back on Bernard Gorman's truck.
Crime scene specialists examined the truck for the evidence of the crime. They were not able to find any blood or hair or forensic evidence that would tie to the analysis of the phone, which indicated on September 23rd that phone was pinging off towers in the Colleyville area, not in Houston, Texas, where he claimed to be. Investigators also found that there had been internet searches on the phone using the words Anita Fox, Fort Worth, Texas.
With Bernard and Gerard Gorman now the prime suspects in the murder of Anita Fox, investigators mobilized to bring them both in for questioning.
After the detectives received all this information, Bernard and Gerard basically disappeared, and we were unable to find them.
And that was a concern because in the traveler community, sometimes they disappear and you'll never find them again.
Father and son duo Gerard and Bernard Gorman are wanted in the brutal murder of beloved grandmother, Anita Fox. But the manhunt comes to an abrupt halt when police get a call from a nearby police department.
Brookshire PD reaches out to let us know that they had a male that has been found deceased in their hotel room, and they said that his name was Gerard Gorman. He is an older man with the gray hair, overweight, and he has the description of Gerard Gorman.
There was rumors that, well, maybe somebody killed Gerard Gorman to shut him up because of his knowledge of the insurance fraud. So an autopsy was done, and it was determined that Gerard died of a heart attack. But there's some disappointment in that the likely perpetrator is not held accountable by the justice system. So, it's mixed emotions, but there is still work to do. They have the potential involvement of his son, Bernard Gorman.
In order to find Bernard, we took to social media to see if there was any clues. We found his wife's Facebook post where it showed that they were in Disney World in Florida.
Detectives bring Bernard to the Colleyville police station and question him again about Anita Fox's murder, hoping he'll confess his involvement.
During this interview, Bernard admitted that he had been in Fort Worth area on September 23rd, and he had been with his father.
He finally admits, okay, I was with my father, and I drove him around up there.
Bernard also told investigators they were following Anita Fox. He said he didn't know why. Bernard also admitted that he did drive his father to the house in Colleyville where Anita Fox was working. His father told him that he was looking at doing a paint job in that house.
When his father came out, police asked him if there was anything unusual about his father, and he said his father was very agitated, and there looked like blood on his arm. But he'd never questioned his father about what happened in the house.
Bernard Gorman's story was completely incredible and unbelievable to investigators. The investigators in no shape or form going to believe that Bernard Gorman had no knowledge of the murder of Anita Fox.
The most blunt way to put it, you'd have to be a moron. I don't even think a moron would not know what transpired in that home.
Detectives can now reconstruct Anita Fox's final 24 hours.
Unbeknownst to Anita, Gerard had basically put $1 million bounty on her that he himself was going to collect. It turns out she wasn't dying fast enough for him.
On September 23rd, just before 11 a.m., Anita Fox arrives at the Lopez residence in Colleyville for her house cleaning job.
At 11:03, Bernard Gorman parked his truck a couple houses down from the Lopez home. Before going into the house, Gerard grabbed a paint bucket so that anybody who saw him going into the house would naturally assume that he's going in there for some type of work on the home.
We believe that when Gerard entered the house at 11:10, he encountered Anita and she put up a fight. But once on the ground, Gerard attacked her, stabbing her multiple times, and killed her. The entire attack lasted less than 5 minutes.
At approximately 11:15 a.m., Gerard Gorman leaves the house and was seen walking out of the Lopez home.
This was a very intentional, premeditated attack.
Bernard Gorman is charged with conspiracy to commit murder. He agrees to a plea deal and is sentenced to 14 years for his role in the murder of 69-year-old Anita Fox.
The most challenging thing for me was trying to figure out the traveler culture. It's something that we've never dealt with. I truly feel for the family, and I'm glad that there was some justice with Bernard getting some time. However, I really wish that Gerard would have been alive to be able to see his sentence.
Life insurance is such a big part of wealth accumulation in the traveler community. It's almost an obsession. But it highlighted how often older folks in the community are expendable, and that proved out in this case.
That murder would have never happened.
Al fought hard to make sure that the murderers were brought to justice.
Despite their tragic and painful loss, Anita's family continues to celebrate her joyful spirit.
Anita Fox was sweet, hardworking. She was a faithful woman. She was a loving, caring mother and grandmother, and didn't deserve to die.
The victim had been severely beaten, very unrecognizable. The cause of death was blunt force trauma from some hard object.
She was in foster care system. She came to live with us at about the age of 10. She had a huge heart.
Somebody close to her had something to do with her death.
Maybe his jealousy had reached a boiling point, and he beat her to death in a fit of rage.
She described him as being in a gang and would definitely do what he needed to do to get what he wanted.
He finds out she was pregnant, and 2 weeks later, she's found in a river.
She came forward and stated that she had witnessed the killing and gives us the name.
That information showed us that he was in the area where she was killed.
The phone pings on the towers for his phone could be what seals his fate.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. Draper, Utah, a picturesque town just outside of Salt Lake City that could be a postcard brought to life.
Draper is just a small commuter town where a lot of people do work in downtown Salt Lake. They commute back and forth.
It's a very nice bedroom community, very nice homes and family oriented.
There are a lot of kids in Utah, a lot of larger families, and so it's very common for kids to just go out in the neighborhood and hang out with their friends.
Draper is known to be a very quiet community when it comes to crime, especially violent crime. It's a very safe environment.
But on a peaceful Sunday morning, a chilling call comes into 911 that rocks Draper to its core.
911, what is the address of the emergency?
I'm at the river bottom at 126 South, where the river bottom trail is, and there's some pools of blood. It's like 2 big piles of blood, and in the water right by the river, there's a shoe.
About 10 a.m., a jogger called to report that he had seen a red shoe in the water in the Jordan River. He was concerned because of the amount of blood near that.
Officers race to the area to investigate.
The Jordan River cuts down the middle of Salt Lake Valley, and along that there is a bike and jogging path, and several bridges that cross back blood in a specific area right near the bridge closer to the river. And on one of the rocks there was a really large area of blood.
Officers search for the source of the significant amount of blood, but can't find an injured person or animal in the area.
We do a test, it's called a presumptive blood test. It takes like 5 minutes and then it'll tell you whether you're dealing with animal blood or possible human blood. The blood was human. We realized something bad has really happened.
Investigators turn their attention to the red shoe that the jogger spotted at the scene.
It looked pretty new and clean. It didn't look like it had been out there for any period of time.
Believing the person could have ended up in the Jordan River, Police launch a helicopter search of the area.
The helicopter was able to go through the river much faster. Downstream a ways, they found a body floating in reeds in that area. The police took several rafts there to retrieve the body. It was a young woman. She was missing her shoe, and on her other foot there was a shoe that matched the one at the crime scene. She had been in the water at this point for several hours, and so her body had swelled a little bit.
We didn't know who she was at that time. She was initially described as like in her 20s, female.
Detective Travis Peterson and CSI Alyssa McElrath are tasked with investigating the case of the murdered Jane Doe.
When we arrived at the scene, right away I could see defensive wounds on her hands and several abrasions to her face.
There was one very predominant injury right here on her forehead. It was a very severe break in this skull area, which is a very hard bone to break. The cause of death was blunt force trauma from some hard object.
The types of injuries seen in this case, we're talking about a weapon that would have both blunt and sharp components to it. Something that would be able to cut, but also bludgeon. Something like a garden spade or shovel.
It made it clear that the person was definitely very angry. Anytime that blunt force is used, it's usually a sign of anger and frustration. Our first impression and feeling was somebody close to her had something to do with her death. Draper Police Department put out a news release of the person that was recovered, described as wearing a red plaid shirt, jeans, and red shoes.
Meanwhile, across town, Veronica Kasperzak is desperate to find her 15-year-old daughter Annie, who has been missing for almost 24 hours.
We were really concerned because nothing like this had ever happened before. Sometime in the day, my ex-husband calls me and says that there was a body in the river, which was close by our house, and so it was concerning. So we call some sort of confirmation that it is or isn't her.
Annie's parents were able to provide information verifying that Annie had been wearing red shoes, and she had some type of surgical scar on her abdomen that was consistent with the body that was recovered.
The police come and they tell us that it is Annie. And then they tell us that somebody killed her. I get this overwhelming rush and sinking feeling in my body. And then I became hysterical.
Veronica can't imagine anyone wanting to harm her adopted daughter, 15-year-old high school freshman Annie Kasperzak.
Annie was the oldest child of her biological mother. She was removed at the age of 3 and really struggled in placement in foster care system. I met Annie for the first time when she was turning 8. I was her caseworker. I had spent a lot of time with her. She was just little and lively, and I knew that getting adopted was what she needs to have a chance. Annie came to live with us at about the age of 10, and she became the immediate big sister. My boys at the time were 6 months old and 3 years old, and they just loved and idolized her. And that was really something that she had been missing. Annie had a huge heart. She didn't want anybody to feel alone or left out. She was in the 9th grade and really embracing the idea of going to high school, hanging out with friends, starting to be able to be allowed to date.
To find Annie Kasperzak's killer, detectives will need to unravel the final 24 hours of her life.
Annie's parents provided information that the night before, on March 10th, they had gone out for the evening, and Annie had stayed home to care for her younger brothers. Around 7 o'clock p.m., her parents, Veronica and James, returned. Annie was there, and everything appeared to be just fine.
Annie said she was going to go down in her room, and that was the last time that they had seen her. That was around 7:45.
I was talking on the phone to my sister. We talked until about 8:40 p.m. And then I go downstairs, fully expecting to find Annie talking on the phone. And she's not there. And I yelled at my husband that Annie's not in her room. I call the police. And I report her as a runaway. We wanted it noted so that if she got in trouble or shut up somewhere else, they would know to bring her home.
So by 8:40 p.m., Annie was gone. So that narrows down the window of what the time of her death would be.
Veronica tells detectives everything she's learned about Annie's movements following her disappearance.
March 10th, and they had information showing that she was in the area of a golf course. The golf course is basically the west bank of the Jordan River area. They tried calling several times with no response, no answer. Annie's parents thought Annie were running away, that she would be running to her boyfriend Chris. So Veronica called Chris at 9:01. Veronica asked if Annie was with him, and he said no, she was not with him. Annie's phone died at about 9:20 p.m. And then the runner reported seeing the blood and a shoe the next morning at 10 a.m.
Veronica tells detectives she believes the answer to who killed her daughter lies in a note Annie left behind.
When Veronica went to go check on Annie, she found a runaway note. In the note, Annie made the statement that she had told her friends that she was pregnant and that she had lied about it, and she felt bad, so this is why she's running away. She apologizes and says that she's running off to California.
This isn't the first time we've heard that she's told her friends that she's pregnant. I'd had meetings with the school counselor where she had told the counselor that she had had sex and was pregnant, and I said, no, she's not. We've been to the doctor. We knew what she was doing. I think she lied to her friends about being pregnant for two reasons. Number one, she really didn't want to be pregnant. And I think she had somehow convinced herself sometime soon that she would be pregnant. She wanted to feel that level of connection. And I think it was her way to be the center, to be the drama, to have their attention, to have their support.
Adolescence is an overly traumatic time. It's a time of storm and stress, and so I think why people, may invent pregnancies, it's wish fulfillment. I want to be needed, I want to be loved, I want to have something to love, or how do I sort out this social milieu in ways that, I can cope and deal with.
Veronica tells investigators that whenever Annie had told them she was pregnant, she always declared her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Chris Bagshaw, was the baby's father.
Annie's parents made it very clear that Annie was close to Chris. That they believed that if she were to run away, that Chris would be involved with that. So I did point detectives immediately toward Chris to find him, to find out where he was around the time of her death.
15-year-old Annie Kasperzak has been found brutally murdered and dumped in a local river. Police already have their first person of interest, Annie's 14-year-old boyfriend, Chris Bagshaw.
Annie met Chris about a year before she died, almost exactly. He was the same age as she was and the same grade that she was. Chris lived in an apartment with his dad, which was also right next to his grandmother. He wasn't quite the outwardly bad boy, but he would make comments. Challenge. Wait a second, you think nobody's gonna love you? Well, guess what? I'm going to. And so it was like she was trying to convince him that he was loved and that he was lovable, and he would pull her in and then push her back, and they had the quintessential teenage, I love you, I hate you relationship.
Looking for clues that could unravel the mystery of Annie's murder, investigators searched the teen's bedroom.
When we searched her room, there were storage tubs of all of her journal entries, just plain notebooks and journals everywhere. She loved to doodle and she loved to write. She was a great little poet, too. Annie used her journal entries as a way of venting or getting stuff out.
There were comments about several things that she had going on in her world at that time. There were a lot of details in reference to Chris. There were comments made about being pregnant. There were comments made about running away.
One of the things the detectives noticed, there was a timeline in there.
She had documented that around March 1st, Chris learned about the fact that she was pregnant. So we have Chris learning about Annie being pregnant on March 1st, according to her journal, and her running away and then found deceased March 10th. Obviously, the timeline became very concerning in reference to Chris's possible involvement.
One of the first things you have to find in a murder case is a motive. Then we see very near the time that she was murdered, less than 2 weeks before, Chris finds out she was pregnant. Now, we knew she wasn't pregnant, but what she wrote there was that she had told him that she was. And 2 weeks later, she's found in a river.
To establish whether Annie and Chris had contact the night of the murder, police pull her cell phone records.
That night, there were several calls between Annie and Chris up until almost 9 o'clock. Phone calls. Others, it would have been a missed call or not answered call. With the number of phone calls, it appeared that there was some type of issue between Annie and Chris.
Chris had reported to Veronica in that 9:01 p.m. phone call the night of Annie's disappearance that he wasn't with Annie that night. He hadn't seen her, hadn't talked to her. So now, those phone records certainly started to raise red flags about his interaction with Annie that night.
To get more answers, detectives pay a visit to Chris at his house.
We're talking with Chris and his father, asking if he knew anything about Annie being killed. At that point, Chris started to get really red and flustered, and Barry knows he's got brand new shoes on. So we asked for clothes and his shoes that he was wearing that night. And as he was about to hand them to me, he just wanted to give me a heads up that earlier in March, Annie had a bloody nose and some of her blood got on his shoes.
With Chris's story raising more red flags, investigators home in on his timeline.
He said that the last time he had seen Annie was like Wednesday or Thursday of the week prior, that he'd tour since. We did confront him about the multiple calls that he had had with Annie in the night in question.
And then his story changed.
Tell me about the things the first time. She said that she was going to her movie, and she had asked me to go with her. I tried to tell her that it was a stupid idea, and she swore me out, and that she hung up the phone. Did she talk to her anymore after that?
We asked Chris about what he was doing on the night in question. Chris said that he was at home and then received a call from his dad around 7:45, letting Chris know that he would be coming home with a friend and that Chris was to go spend the night at his grandma's house, which is 2 or 3 doors down from his in the apartment complex. Chris said that he put some clothes together, went to his grandma's house initially for a couple minutes just to leave his stuff, and then he walked to a friend's house. When he got to the friend's house, nobody answered the door, so he immediately returned to his grandma's house. He arrived there right around 9 o'clock and played video games, watched movies till he fell asleep sometime around 11:30 that night. We interviewed his grandma, and she did verify the events of Chris's actions that night.
With Chris having an alibi for the night, we weren't looking at him as the suspect anymore.
With Chris's alibi clearing him, investigators focused their attention on Annie's supposed pregnancy.
We talked to Chris about his relationship with Annie. It was different than what Annie had described in her journals. Chris described it as more of a friendship, and they had been sexually involved or had sexual contact one time. Chris said that he was told by Annie she was pregnant and that it was not his. He revealed that Annie was telling him an individual named LJ was the father of the baby.
She told me that she didn't want her family to find out that she had LJ sneak into her house and had sex with her. So she asked me if I could take blame for it, and I told her that I would agree to let her know which one it is.
LJ was older. He lived up in Ogden, Utah, and he had a criminal history. Chris described LJ as a gang member connected with a gang in California. Chris was very vocal and verbal about concerns he had about LJ.
There are local gangs here. Because we live in the western United States, sometimes there is an affiliation or an association with Southern California gangs. There is a potential that the place Annie was saying she was going, California, had some sort of a tie to this person who had ties to gangs.
Chris tells detectives that LJ belongs to the Bloods gang.
The Westside Bloods are a pretty infamous and ruthless street gang, among the most dangerous in California. So you're talking apex predators, even among other violent street criminals. Like most gangs, their markets, if you will, run the gamut. Prostitution, trafficking in people and narcotics. Then, of course,
they made threats against him. It seemed to be because LJ might be jealous or concerned that Annie had such a close relationship with Chris.
To validate Chris's statements, investigators turned to Annie's close friend, Spencer Criddle.
Spencer and Chris and Annie were this little trio where the three of them were often going around and hanging out.
Spencer said that Annie had called him a couple times before Annie went missing. He'd missed the calls. She did leave voicemails for him. She seemed to be upset, but he said that he did not talk to her that night, and that the last time he'd seen her was middle of the week prior when Chris and others were with Annie and him at his house.
At that time, Spencer corroborated Chris's claim that Annie got this bloody nose. He said, yeah, we were all over here, and Annie just got a bloody nose. It was really weird. He also told us that Annie and Chris were friends more than anything.
But Spencer also indicated that she did have a boyfriend named LJ.
Spencer's report of LJ was that he had hacked into Annie's email and sent a scary message to her that was intended for Chris, and Spencer had seen it.
Spencer also described LJ as a violent person. So now Chris and Spencer both made statements about the fact that Annie had told them that LJ could hurt them or could hurt her. She described LJ as being very aggressive and would definitely do what he needed to do to get what he wanted.
The question is, was he responsible for this crime? Could she have met up with LJ to run away with him, only to find that his jealousy had reached a boiling point, to the point that he beat her to death in a fit of rage?
In the brutal murder of high school freshman Annie Kasperzak, investigators are zeroing in on a prime suspect, Annie's secret boyfriend and alleged gang member, LJ.
There was a cloud of mystery around LJ when it came to Annie and her friends. She kind of chose what she told some people and not other people. Some friends thought she was making a mistake hanging out with somebody that had gang ties.
Annie was trying to embrace living on the edge. She had known some girls when she was in a treatment center that had some genuine gang affiliations, and so she had kind of adopted this idea, well, here's a different way of belonging. Well, here's another type of family.
She also indicated to one of her friends that if she had to pick a gang, she would be a Blood.
Detectives wonder if this is Annie's way of supporting LJ, a member of the West Side Bloods.
A lot of Annie's friends had knowledge of the fact that Annie said that she was pregnant and that LJ was the father of her baby, but they were aware that Annie was telling people that Chris was the father because she was concerned about what her parents would think. We didn't have a full name from them or anybody connected to him. We didn't know who LJ was, just that he was known, or at least said to be, a violent person. It was very concerning. We needed to figure out who he was.
We contacted the gang units. We made contacts with all the surrounding agencies to see if they had kids with gang affiliations with the moniker LJ, and were never able to come back with anything close to how we were described he is.
Unable to locate Annie's mysterious boyfriend, LJ, investigators shift course, looking for new leads.
We received a call from the West Jordan Police Department advising us that detectives had a witness there that was being investigated for a financial crime. And that witness was providing information indicating that she had witnessed Annie being beaten and assaulted. We went over to interview her. She provided very detailed information about the night of March 10th.
This witness that comes forward, this woman, Heather, she gives us the name Daniel Ferry, and she says that she had witnessed the killing of Annie Kasperzak at Daniel Ferry's hands.
I did recognize the name. Daniel Ferry had been investigated and charged with crimes in the past.
He had a history of violence. He certainly fit the idea of a person who might do something like this. He was involved in the drug world and was reported as being a very violent person. At that point, detectives asked, "Do you know anyone named LJ?" And she immediately said, "Oh yeah, I know a named LJ." And she gave the name of somebody that the initials lined up, where in the gang world he may have adopted that moniker. And she gave a description of him, and also that he was from California, which goes back to the note where Annie said she was running away to.
Believing the confidential informant Heather could break the case wide open, detectives questioned her about March 10th, the night Annie was murdered.
She stated that that night LJ and Annie had shuttled up to Daniel Ferry's house.
This witness said that Annie had been out in the garage with LJ, believed that LJ and Annie had had sex. When Annie came back into the house, Daniel told Annie it was his turn, and she refused. Daniel was very upset about this, grabbed Annie by the neck and head area.
Danny had told one of his other friends, "We need to take out the trash." And then they had taken her away.
When they returned, she described their clothes as having blood on them. When she asked where Annie was, one of them told her that Annie had gone swimming, kind of a sarcastic response to her question.
The clear implication there was that she had ended up in the river. It's not right before the victim dies. This woman who was talking to the police were investigating for another crime. So anytime you're dealing with an informant, you do have to take with a grain of salt.
When we were were putting everything together. Annie's phone records for that night showed there were also phone calls Annie received from an unknown or blocked caller. So from information provided from Annie's friends, and then also now this witness, and then what this witness personally observed, we were very concerned that Daniel Ferry and LJ were involved with her death.
Things that are lining up is all pointing that we're going in the right direction.
When detectives search for LJ, they don't have to go far.
We found him in the jail system.
During the interview, we'd learned that he did know Daniel Ferry, but he denied being with Daniel Ferry on the night in question, said he was not at that house, and had no clue who Annie was. And then he made statements about the fact that his nickname was LG, not LJ, so that raised some suspicion to the statements provided by that witness, which led some question of whether or not LJ was really involved in Annie's death.
After a short interview, it's more apparent that he has nothing to do with the case. And he also was locked up in the jail during the time of her murder. So we were able to dismiss LJ as a suspect.
With the man known as LJ appearing to be a dead end, detectives turn their attention to their other potential suspect, local drug dealer Daniel Ferry.
I interviewed Daniel Ferry, and Daniel denied having any knowledge of Annie. He said he didn't know anything about what happened to her. About Annie.
Annie who?
Annie.
Who the is Annie?
Annie is a girl that was at your house for a party last weekend.
Dude, I have no idea who Annie is.
We did push Daniel, but he adamantly denied that he was involved in Annie's death. Daniel said that on the night in question, when Annie went missing, that he did have people to his house, that the witness was there, so all of that was verified. Daniel also denied that there was an LJ there. What about LJ or something like that? LJ?
LJ? Who the hell's LJ?
That's what I'm asking you.
Straight up, I'm telling you right now, I don't know anybody who goes by LJ.
Okay.
I don't.
Short time later, Daniel invoked his right to an attorney, and we did not ask any additional questions.
Unable to speak with Daniel further, police do a deep dive into his background.
We learned that Daniel Ferry did have a nickname that he used at one point in time of Little Joe. Obviously, having the initials LJ brought some suspicion as to whether or not he was the LJ that's being referenced by Chris.
With suspicion swirling around Daniel Ferry, police get a search warrant for his house.
When we arrived at Daniel Ferry's house, the carpet was gone. You could tell that they were painting the floor, the carpet being pulled up, new flooring being put in. All those go to line up that there's something that happened in the house and there's something they're doing to cover it up.
There was damage to the wall in areas that were consistent with what the witness had provided about seeing that Daniel grabbed Annie, rammed her head into a wall where she went to the ground unconscious, along with some small areas that appeared to be blood on the walls. Annie's murder could have happened there. It was very concerning. He had a criminal history. He was a very violent, aggressive person.
At this point, they arrested Danny for probable cause of Annie's murder.
Detectives have local drug dealer Daniel Ferry in custody on suspicion of Annie Kasperzak's brutal murder.
Danny had outstanding warrants on other cases, and this gave the police a small window of time to try to corroborate the witness Heather's story that indeed it was Annie at Danny's house the night that Annie was murdered.
There were different samples that were collected from Daniel Ferry's house to find forensic evidence to show what happened or who was involved.
As detectives await the lab results from Daniel Ferry's house, they pull his phone records.
They looked into where Danny was at the time of the murder, and his phone records didn't put him anywhere near Danny's house or the crime scene.
Then, the DNA results come back, and they are positive for human blood.
Every sample that they tested, the blood that was found on the wall, the blood that was found on the floor, any other blood that was found was not Annie's blood. So that exonerated Danny of being with or around Annie that night. Now, you had problems with Heather's story because it didn't match the scientific evidence.
The night of March 10th, Danny actually was committing a violent crime, but it wasn't against Annie Kasperzak. He was actually tormenting somebody else. There was a girl that owed him drug money that he had kidnapped and used her as a human dartboard. And we were able to rule out that he didn't have anything to do with Annie Kasperzak.
With Daniel Ferry no longer a suspect in the case, investigators circle back to the witness Heather, who misled police about Annie's murder.
We asked her why, and her response was basically that she knew something bad happened at Daniel Ferry's that night. She felt like Daniel was dangerous, and that he should be charged for what he did to somebody.
Heather also confessed to manipulating the details she provided to police regarding Annie and LJ.
She had heard the information about Annie being found deceased on the news, and she admitted that when she was asked about LJ that she made stuff up and knew them to be.
So we have just wasted all this time? It's very frustrating to investigators, but that's what we do. We have to follow the evidence. So we have to go back to the drawing board and start over again.
This is really where the mettle of investigators is so important. Despite the fact that you've hit these roadblocks, you've been detoured to look at these red herrings, at the end of the day, you have to dust yourself off. You have the murder of a 15-year-old girl to investigate and to solve, and that killer is still out there.
As we continue to investigate more, we're still going back to Annie's phone records and journals, and it becomes more apparent that there's probably not an LJ. This is just something that Annie probably made up for Chris.
With yet another suspect ruled out, the investigation hits a wall. In search of new leads, investigators circle back to Annie's close friends.
They went back to the main person of interest, which was Chris. Everyone had mentioned Chris. The person that Annie seemed closest to was Chris. The person tied to this pregnancy, by all accounts, was Chris.
Annie's friends also provided information that Annie was concerned that Chris was not happy about her being pregnant. That definitely led to some concern and suspicion that Chris might have a desire to stop all of that happening.
Investigators zero in on Annie and Chris's cell phone records, looking to uncover what really happened to Annie the night of March 10th.
We learned that there were some text messages that had been deleted that Chris had sent to Spencer the day that Spencer told detectives about Annie's nosebleed. In the messages, Chris was basically telling Spencer that he wanted Spencer to verify that Annie did have a nosebleed if and when he was interviewed by the police, so that it was consistent with Chris's statement.
The police talked to Spencer, again this teenage kid who had been thrust into this situation. Spencer pretty quickly came clean. He recanted and said he didn't remember the bloody nose, but he had said that it happened because Chris had told him to. So now the police have not only blood on the shoes, not only a artificial story about that blood, but a clear desire from Chris to get rid of that evidence, to try to explain it away.
Then Spencer provided information that Chris was upset about Annie being pregnant, that Chris was concerned that he was the father.
Spencer told us that there was an argument that happened that night between Chris and Annie, and that Chris did in fact go down to the river where they had a fight.
To establish if Chris had the opportunity to kill Annie, investigators take a closer look at his phone records.
The night of March 10th, between 6:01 p.m. and 8:59 p.m., Chris and Annie had spoke 10 times. In reference to the block numbers that called Annie on that night, we learned that Chris had been dialing *67 to dial Annie's number, which blocked his phone number so that on that night and his involvement. At 9:01, Chris was telling Veronica he hadn't seen Annie when she called him. But Draper detectives were able to get cell tower information from Chris's phone on March 10th. And the cell tower information painted a pretty clear picture that Chris was not where Chris had said that he was at his grandmother's house.
That information showed us that at 9:01, Chris was in the area of the Jordan River near the bridge where Annie was killed.
With Chris already having an alibi, his grandma saying that he was there the night, at that point we weren't looking at him as serious. But now, seeing the phone pings on the towers for his phone, that we realized there was no way he was home. Those phone pings could be what seals his fate.
Investigators are working on the theory that Chris Bagshaw killed his 15-year-old girlfriend, Annie Kasperzak, believing she was pregnant with his baby. To prove their theory, they need to break Chris's alibi.
Chris's phone records showed his grandmother called him that night, and we didn't understand why she would need to call him if he was at her house. But Chris was at the river that night with Annie.
Through very good investigation and very credible cell phone triangulation evidence, they were able to put him indisputably at the scene.
Investigators charge Chris Bagshaw with Annie's murder and obstruction of justice for lying to police.
Chris was a juvenile, 14 years old at the time of the murder. Juvenile courts in Utah only have jurisdiction over somebody until they're 21. So Chris would only serve a couple of years in some type of juvenile correctional facility. There's a process that the prosecutors go through to certify Chris as an adult to be tried in adult court.
Young offenders are usually given some level of leniency. But in this case, with Chris Bagshaw, the ruthlessness of his murder and luring her to the bridge earmarks him to an adult offender status.
During the process of Chris being charged in adult court, we learned that there was a cellmate who was incarcerated with Chris. They came forward and said that Chris had confessed to him that he did kill Annie. He described accurate details about Annie's injuries and how they occurred.
This witness that comes forward tells us that it was the shovel that caused all the damage on Annie.
With Chris's jailhouse confession, investigators are able to piece together the final hours of Annie Kasperzak's life.
On March 10th, Annie had a normal evening. Her parents went out for dinner while she watched her younger siblings.
While Annie's parents were out, Annie received a telephone with her story that she was pregnant with Chris's baby, not telling Chris that she really wasn't pregnant. She told him she wanted to run away. She told him that she wanted him to go with her, and he agreed. But Chris's actual plan was to get Annie alone so that he could follow through with killing her.
7 o'clock, Annie's parents come home. They talk for a little bit. 7:45, Annie goes down to her room.
8:40 p.m., Annie had snuck out of her room and left a note. Chris was at the Jordan River Parkway to meet up with Annie, and he had a shovel.
At 8:56, Annie was in the area of the Jordan River.
At 9:01 p.m., Chris answered Veronica's call, with Annie at his side.
After that call, he took that shovel and he beat Annie repeatedly.
Wonder if I could bring them to live. I could bring my lover. And baby, you make me wait. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Play from you. Better again. I saw the looking out of the window. Wonder if I could bring them down. I could bring my love now, baby. You made.
Shorty, if you really wanna go, then you gotta take me the mess. I tried to soak in all the years and take it all in, but I come up for a breath and cry. I gave my drama, gave my simple, gave my friends a helping hand. I bet you know that they are dead. I wish I could tell you this. The talk is not a town. The more we talk, the talk is not a town. I did not come this far for any stronger. All of a sudden there was nothing left. Well, last night a doctor thought you were lying. I never meant to keep you alive. There might be stuff we said that sound dumb to you.